was that Asmongold is a broad definition of what the First Amendment is when criticizing Europe, but when it comes to the United States, he's willing to say that a lawful permanent resident can be deported without even being formally charged with a crime. There is no possible theory underlying conceptual foundation by which you can believe in freedom of speech that's so important that an American can tell a European country, this is what you've been doing the entire conversation. Who do you think's spoken more of this conversation? Just curious. You have by 3 times. Exactly. And I think that anybody that thinks that freedom of speech is important, especially viewpoint neutral laws, like deporting people because they've done a bad act, not just because of who they support, that's an important concept to protect. That people shouldn't be deported just for supporting a state that the government doesn't currently like. Is this not a problematic environment if we're free speech warriors?
So the government decides what's hateful or not, and whenever they make that decision, they decide to censor you arbitrarily. And people in Europe are okay with this? Y'all need to throw some tea into the water or some shit. Like, you can't let this happen. Yeah, bro, you're gonna let these clowns boss you around. No, we're not? Well, then organize and get rid of them. It's hard to say whether he committed a crime, but there's a higher standard of conduct for people that are green card holders than people who are naturalized citizens. And he wasn't meeting that conduct. So he's getting deported, hopefully. And there should be? Yeah, they should be. And I support this completely. I hope they do this to more of them.
Yeah, I am Scott. You can call me Scott from Fabian Liberty. I'm an anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, debater, mostly talk about philosophy and economics, occasionally psychology, etc. You can find me on Fabian Liberty. Just Google. I'm streaming on YouTube.
All right.
I don't feel like you need an introduction at this point. Like, let's be honest.
That's all good. Okay. We were disagreeing over some Asmongold stuff.
Yeah.
I think my primary contention was I feel like it's extremely hypocritical to be so narrow in our understanding of the First Amendment when it comes to people who are lawful permanent residents exercising their free speech, but then be so broad when talking about freedom of speech in general when it applies to popular or political opinions that we like. So for instance, when conservatives will often talk about how getting banned from social media is actually an infringement on my First Amendment right, I just feel like there's a lot of hypocrisy in those two positions.
Okay, there's a couple of things there. So first thing I want to say is it starts off, right, with you posting a video of like free speech, Asmongold with one position and another position, right? My argument is that these are wildly different cases and that it's not hypocritical to be against one or the other. And so in order before we can get anywhere, right, you know, and you mentioned this yourself, you say, you know, you think it's wrong or bad in some regard to be broad in one sense and then not in another sense. What do you mean by free speech, and can we work within that for the bounds of this confirmation, right? Like, I'm willing to do an internal critique of your concept of free speech, but right now we're throwing out free speech as like First Amendment, as an idea.
Yeah, I would say freedom of speech. Well, I guess my critique is an internal critique of the standard conservative position on freedom of speech. So do you want to critique my version of freedom of speech, or do you want to critique my internal critique of their version of freedom of speech?
Okay, well, you're posting a video, right, saying like this is his idea of free speech in one context, this is his idea of free speech in another context, right?
Yeah.
So in order for you to critique it, right, you would need a starting position of what you believe free speech is before you can go into an internal critique of what they believe free speech is. Because in neither of those are you showcasing an example of how Asmongold, not the right, which obviously isn't a monolith, and there's going to be a lot of disagreement, right? How they are defining it.
Well,
right?
that's the whole point of an internal critique is that I don't need a position on it. I can give one. I don't mind arguing about it. But the whole point of an internal critique is I'm just critiquing the two positions that they presented now.
No, I know what an internal critique is, right? Like I don't need to be a consequentialist, right, to critique consequentialism, or even more so to critique how you arrived at the answer for, you know, something through a consequential analysis. I could also do a consequential analysis without being a consequentialist in that regard, right? But what I am saying is that if you are saying that there is hypocrisy or that there's something wrong here in his domain, obviously you have an opinion of what free speech is before you gain, before you go into this position of like internally critiquing what theirs are. I want to know what yours are, where you're coming from first. Then we can maybe move into why you think he's utilizing two different definitions of freedom of speech, and thus is the contradiction that creates the hypocrisy that you're supposedly pointing out. I think it's all bullshit, but I don't want to like,
yeah, that's fine.
Say that from the jump.
Sure. Yeah, okay. I can give my position. I have no problem doing that and argue over my position. I don't think for an internal critique, I don't think I necessarily need to have a position, right? Like somebody can say, I think stormtroopers are tall and I think stormtroopers are short, and I can say these positions are inconsistent. I don't have to have a position on if I think stormtroopers are tall, short, or medium build. I can just say that your own position, not you, but the person's position is inconsistent, right? But I can give my position on my.
Hold on.
Yeah.
You're critiquing, saying that there's multiple definitions that they're using, right?
Yes, correct.
And you're saying that there's hypocrisy in that.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna have a conversation about that, and we're gonna use the term free speech throughout that conversation. So I need to know what you mean by that, as opposed to you jumping to different definitions that they give and how they contradict. I need to know what you mean when you say free speech.
Okay, and then I'm so sorry. This is getting so bad. Do you need to know what I mean when I say free speech for me, or what I mean when I say they believe in freedom of speech for them? Which one are you asking for?
I'm like, we're off to a bad start. Like,
yeah,
I'm not trying to marry you to your definition for an internal critique. I just need to know what you mean, and then we can get into what they mean. We can talk about the differences, like why yours is consistent, why this is inconsistent.
Okay, sure.
I can give mine as well if you prefer.
I'm just going to ramble a little bit, and you tell me if I'm on the right track or whatever. Okay, so for me, I have a very legalistic interpretation. When somebody says First Amendment, I'm thinking of the First Amendment as applied in the United States in a legal manner. So generally, this means the government taking actions to restrict a person's freedom of speech. This can be through a variety of ways, like arresting people who are doing things you don't like. It could mean making certain things like liable for civil action, so like defamation and stuff like that could be an infringement on your freedom of speech. It could mean making certain types of speech, like I said criminal, so like incitement to violence. When I'm talking about freedom of speech, I usually, if I'm talking like First Amendment freedom of speech, I'm talking in that regard, the legal defense of the First Amendment. Now, for conservatives, I feel like conservatives bounce back and forth between when it's speech that they like. The First Amendment is the broadest, like spiritual. This is this is what we mean in our hearts when we say freedom of speech, and that extends all the way to we shouldn't ban opposing viewpoints on Twitter because that violates like the American idea of freedom of speech. And then when it comes to people they don't like, that becomes very narrow. Like, well, if a green card holder is protesting, but they support a group that the United States has designated as a terrorist group, they don't have the right to do that, and they should be deported. So I would argue that one of these views is very broad and expansive, and the other is incredibly narrow. And I don't know what justification you could give for the former that wouldn't fail the latter. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So from here on out, we'll say First Amendment, we're talking about the negative right from the state to have your speech infringed upon in some capacity by the state. And then when we say free speech, we might mean that more broadly from like a utilitarian perspective of like, the concept of free speech or like the public square, et cetera. Is that okay?
Sure.
I just don't want us to get too confused and too in the weeds, right? So
that's fine. I imagine if we're chatting, assuming both of us are doing our best to understand the other, we'll if there's like a confusion, we can just clarify.
Okay, yeah. So in this instance, right, where you're like quipping at Asmongold and accusing him of hypocrisy, right? The freedom of speech that you're highlighting in the first half of the video on the left side of the frame, right, is him reacting to JD Vance in Europe, right? So obviously he can't be talking about freedom of speech from a legalistic perspective or the First Amendment, because those things don't exist in Europe because they are not under the American Constitution. Some of them have freedom of speech in like their charters, right? But they don't have the First Amendment or the Bill of Rights or our specific Constitution. So clearly, in that first context, he can't be talking about it from a negative rights from the state as pursuant to the First Amendment, because we're not talking about America, obviously, right? Like it even says in the caption, we're talking about Europe, and he's reacting to like people being arrested for praying silently near an abortion clinic, or like people, in England, for example, saying, I don't like all these fucking Pakistani flags in my city, and then the police coming and potentially arresting them and things of that nature, or these other kind of like egregious edge cases, right? They're clearly not the day-to-day things, but scary, in that speech, right? So clearly we're talking about the overarching concept of freedom of speech, that you ought be able to address your government or speak your mind and risk being offensive, without some form of coercion used against you, either by the state or some corporate power or something, right?
I would agree that that's necessary, that you're necessarily not talking about American freedom of speech. But this is also kind of my criticism of people like Asmongold, is it seems like when Americans criticize Europeans' freedom of speech, they do it from an American legalistic understanding, or even an American maybe conceptual understanding, where freedom of speech is as defined by the First Amendment of the United States. And if you're a European country, you're not following that definition, you don't have freedom of speech. That's like a criticism that I have of people like Asmongold.
Okay, yeah, no. So that's a fair assessment, right? Which is to say, like, if you have hate speech laws, right, you don't have freedom of speech,
correct?
Right. So there is certainly a reference to the American ideal.
Oh, wait, just to clarify, when I said
rights that we have from the First Amendment.
Yeah. So when somebody says, like, if you have hate speech laws, you don't have freedom of speech. In my mind, that statement is at ends with what you just said, where you're like, well, when we talk about freedom of speech, we mean we don't necessarily mean the American definition. We just mean like a broader conceptual one.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I'm saying...
No, I said that's a fair point.
What's a fair point? Sorry.
I was agreeing with you. I said that's a fair point, and then I was summarizing to make sure I'm steel manning your position.
Yeah. Wait, I'm sorry. Just to understand, when you said that's a fair point, what point of mine did you say was a fair point? I'm just trying to understand.
I'm saying it's a fair... I said it's a fair point that an American, under the context of recognizing freedom of speech, right, that they live in a cultural context of the First Amendment, and when they look at a European nation that has hate speech laws, right, where they're not free to speak in the same way that we're free to speak, via the constitutional that they claim that that's not freedom of speech.
Yeah, so I would say that's not a fair point. That was my criticism, because to critique the European system's concept of freedom of speech and say that they don't actually have freedom of speech because they don't have our legal understanding of freedom of speech, I would say that's a silly criticism, which I feel like conservatives engage
We're saying the same things, but I think
all right,
like I was saying you're correct.
Okay.
Like that's fine. I think you're making a fair point that comes from that context, right?
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
But so the hypocrisy, you keep jumping to conservatives, which is something you did later in the conversation when you said you were making your real argument, as opposed to the arguments you were making before, which were against Asmongold. So are you saying that
wait.
Like when you don't have any critique of Asmongold?
No.
Wait,
when I was saying
only talking about conservatives?
When I was saying real argument,
that seems to be what you're saying.
No. When I was saying real argument, I think what we were talking about was my definition of freedom of speech versus my internal critique of the two different definitions proffered by Asmongold or conservatives. Like, I have a position on freedom of speech, but I don't think that was part of the conversation or the contention, but we can get into that if you want. But that was my
right.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is I'm seeing the parallels here, right? Where you keep switching. I keep talking about Asmongold because that's a critique, because I think your critique is bullshit, and I think it's just like a clickbait thing to like gain a little drama, gain a little rage, just do what you do, entertain, not necessarily worry about political truth or progressive policy or any of those things.
Okay.
That's my belief of you. Obviously you wouldn't agree with that, but that's where I'm coming from. And so you keep switching to conservatives, right, or the right, etc., as opposed to my initial issue, which is that you're claiming hypocrisy and you're utilizing a large swath of different people that you can grab examples from and separating yourself away from the individual. So is your argument actually against Asmongold, or is this just a vector for a larger conversation because you think conservatives in general are hypocrites and bad and don't believe in free speech, but you don't actually have a critique of Asmongold specifically?
Well, it's both. Asmongold is a vector to critique the conservative position because I think Asmongold represents the standard conservative position right now. Also, is a language thing. When I say conservative right now, I generally just mean MAGA is what I'm saying. So whatever the Republican Party or MAGA right now currently believes is what I'm saying. And I think that Asmongold embodies that. So when I critique Asmongold on his hypocrisy, I'm also using that as a vector to broadly critique MAGA or conservatives on their hypocrisy, because I think he represents it. I think they line up.
Okay, so I would like for you to flesh out, if you can, for me, your argument, because I'm still not seeing the hypocrisy thus yet, right? Like you're saying that the conservatives use a strict sense of constitution when it applies to things for them, and then they use a broad sense when it applies to things that they dislike.
I believe that just the opposite.
Where's
I think
the hypocrisy?
The opposite of what you just said. So, yeah. So I think that the hypocrisy is when conservatives speak broadly about freedom of speech, it seems like they're very mindful of the concept of a chilling effect. So an example of this might be when the Twitter files came out, a lot of conservatives said just the fact that the FBI would even communicate with Twitter about some accounts is enough to create a chilling effect on speech on that environment, and that would count as a violation of our freedom of speech as Americans. Or an example would be from the Trump camp. I think he sued both Facebook and X for banning his social media account. And he said it was a violation of his First Amendment right as an American to be heard, to have his freedom of speech. So that seems to be with the understanding of if we ban certain types of speech or allow actors that are large enough to target certain types of speech, it will create a chilling effect that will make it hard for Americans to voice their opinion on certain subjects, and we would just be chilling political conversation. But then when it comes to people who are protesting, if they're lawful permanent residents or visa holders, well, they can be deported just for supporting a group that the president, through no majority in Congress or really through his own arbitrary discretion, declares a terrorist group. Well, how would that not create an insane chilling effect where people are afraid of protesting even a certain thing because they might be on the wrong side of what the president decides is a terror group? That seems like it would be incredibly chilling. So I don't understand how you can defend one and not the other.
So again, now I may agree with you to a certain extent when you're only talking about conservatives, right? I certainly, like, conservative is such a large group that some would hold that opinion, right? But the original critique is against Asmongold, and so the cases are specific, right? They are not these broad, vague things, and you're adding in this element of like the Twitter files and things of that nature. You're saying that
wait, to be clear, I'm not adding that in. I'm just giving examples of like what the conservative belief is.
Well, you did on Twitter as well. You did on Twitter as a response to like what I had. Right. So that when I say you're adding that specific, it's the same specific example you gave. Okay. Right. So the specific context here is that Asmongold specifically, that you're critiquing, is a hypocrite for being against the kind of egregious things, examples that may or may not be true. I don't want to get into all of that, like which ones aren't true from JD Vance's position, right? The assumption that at least some of these are true, that those are bad, that those are scary, or that those have some chilling effect, even if you will, right? That going after one of those people has a chilling effect when you make hate speech laws, right? And then you're now kind of like, because you're using conservatives, you're also decoupling yourself from the case of Mahmoud Khalil, which is what he's looking at. And I fail to see where there is a hypocrisy under, this concept of free speech, where it seems like you're using conservatives to then paint a concept where conservatives in one context are hyper-specific and then in another context are not hyper-specific, and that is where this contradiction comes in. But again, we're talking about Europe, so this is really like there are many layers where that connection you actually haven't made, and I don't believe you actually believe it. So I'm trying to figure out. Stop running to conservatives and explain how Asmongold is a hypocrite for being for deporting Mahmoud Khalil, but being against people praying, near an abortion clinic and getting arrested, or people getting arrested for mean tweets.
Okay, so I guess what part of this do I need to connect, do you think, to make the argument coherent?
Well, I mean, you need to showcase the contradiction. Instead, you were just saying
the contradiction.
Conservatives as a group.
Okay, sure. I'll stop saying conservatives as a group.
Specific in this area, not in another.
Sure, I'm using it interchangeably with Asmongold, but I'll be specific to Asmongold. So I believe that Asmongold would be hypercritical of Europe's freedom of speech under a very broad definition of the First Amendment, a very, very broad understanding that people getting banned even by social media platforms or European countries prohibiting certain activity or making certain activity illegal, that's a violation of freedom of speech. But when it comes to the United States, I don't know how he could possibly conceive of a European country violating freedom of speech just because they have a different perspective on what they'll defend and what they won't. And then when you come to the United States, you can start deporting lawful permanent residents because they're protesting groups that the president has said is a bad group. I don't know what the consistent principle would be that you would appeal to there that would allow the deportation of Mahmoud, whatever the guy's name is, Khalil, or Khalil Mahmoud. And but so you that's okay under freedom of speech, but Germany or Sweden or the UK having different hate speech laws is not okay. I don't know what possible consistent principle you could appeal to there other than just being hypocritical.
So you're saying that you need a consistent principle to deport one, but to be against the other, right?
Yeah, and I can't imagine what that would be, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say, like, just as an example, right? Because we're kind of pretending to understand the inner workings of Asmongold's mind here, right?
No,
but
I've watched a lot of Asmongold content. I know how he views on this stuff, but.
Well, sure, but you don't have his inner monologue memorized, you know. Like,
I don't need his inner monologue. I have his outer monologue. He's spoken about a lot of these issues before. I know what he feels about the Twitter files and what he feels about freedom of speech and people getting banned on platforms. Like, I've heard him talk about all this before. But
sure, you have a good understanding of Asmongold's concept of freedom of speech, presumably.
Sure, okay,
I'll buy that. That's fine. So regardless, yeah, the consistent principle could be. Like I just need one example, so I'll give, sure one. So in one instance, his concept of freedom of speech would be, hate speech laws that aren't a call to violence, that aren't a call to action against anybody, that are simply constructed because they're offensive or because they harm people through the usage of words without any assault or battery or any, calls to violence or action or any support of any terrorist groups. Could be something that is wrong and against the concept of free speech. And then in the example of, let's say, Mahmoud Khalil, someone that like worked for UNRWA and then came over here, and then someone who claims that he's not, a representative of Columbia University apartheid divestment, but gives speeches where he says that violence is acceptable and that all forms of violence will be called terrorism. So and so it doesn't matter what type of violence we do. A person that actively is a representative for them after they've taken over portions of private property, because Columbia University is a private school. It's not a public school, so there's no way, shape, or form public property that they take over property. The same person that the DOJ or the Department of Justice is saying that they're passing out specific Hamas flyers, and that the law specifically gives an example in the state statute for green card holders that people that support groups like, for example, they actually give an example of the Palestinian Liberation Organization would be someone that is disqualified from green card status because they are, supporting and engaged in terrorist activity just by being a representative. So I think those violent actions, those what he called in his clip, why are we importing people that are a problem, right? Because obviously citizenship versus non-citizenship kind of creates a distinction here. I think all of those things together could very easily, like they wouldn't necessarily be my position, but very obviously show that these are wildly different comparisons where one could still claim to be for free speech and one could claim, that this person in particular is a problem that is engaged in disruptive, destructive things towards American culture and private property and violating all of the things that they said that they would do when they signed the green card.
So there's a lot there. The very simple question would be, so if you're talking about, like, for instance, like incitement to violence, then the question would be, okay, well, was he charged with a crime? If we feel like he did a behavior that was criminal, why was he not charged with any crimes for this?
Yeah, I mean, I personally am for, giving the person a trial.
Doesn't matter. We're talking about Asmongold's position, not you personally. But the question would be, if we're going to say,
right,
well, part of the reason
that's irrelevant. That's irrelevant to the whether or not these are disanalogous and whether or not this showcases hypocrisy.
Well, no, I think it's super relevant, because if you're going to say
the actual argument.
Well, if you're going to say, unless he's trying to say that we can determine who's for this to be true, his argument would have to be we can determine who's inciting violence or not without relying on a court to do so. But that would be a pretty bizarre claim for an American to make, no?
again, it's not relevant to whether or not he's a hypocrite in terms of free speech, right? Like whether or not he supports, a green card holder's status and their right to a criminal trial or criminal investigation or habeas corpus, right? One of those things, that would be a different right or a different extant right that you might derive from the government or something. We've moved out of the domain of freedom of speech, and now we've moved in the domain of like the right to a trial, etc. Someone that is a green card holder, not a citizen, is someone that is here, I guess you could say at the luxury of our state or whatever. I'm a fucking anarchist. I don't think anybody should be deported unless they're proven to do property damage, right?
Wait, so do you think,
that's
I'm
not
just
relevant
curious,
to whether or not
sure,
you're trying to call him a hypocrite.
do you
just
think that,
adding new layers
do you think that
of things you don't like.
Do you think that he would say that he doesn't think that lawful permanent residents are entitled to a trial? Do you think that would be his?
I don't know what he would
Well, we have to be able to make an assumption. Otherwise, then I could, in that case, literally nobody is a hypocrite ever, because I could always invent a fantabulous, fictitious position that would resolve any issue if I can just redefine things at will.
That's not true. That's not true.
Give me an example and I'll do it.
You're
Give me an
trying to
example,
add.
I'll do it.
You're adding a domain that is not what is up for discussion and not what you are critiquing. You're adding new information and asking me to guess what they would think in that position. That's not relevant to whether or not you found hypocrisy that you felt you needed to
If I can't make some basic assumptions, you could just say like, oh, well, maybe Asmongold doesn't think that green card holders are humans, so they're not entitled to any rights. And that would be an.
I mean, you could, and it would be equally irrelevant to whether or not you showcased.
Yeah, but if I can't make some basic assumptions
on freedom of speech in one and the other.
Yeah, but how could I possibly make any claim of hypocrisy ever if I can't make some basic assumptions about fundamental beliefs as a human being? Like,
well, you could have a well-reasoned philosophy and apply logic and find a contradiction.
Okay, can you give me...
You can't find a contradiction. Okay. So now you're trying to invent other positions that he may or may not have, so it showcases things that are bad in the situation.
Okay, wait, I'm just curious. Can you...
That he's a hypocrite. So I'm like, why would you do that? I think it's bullshit. I think they're disanalogous. Okay. And now I don't want to muddy the water. I want you to nail
We're not muddering the waters.
Can you give me bullshit?
Sure. I just want an example. Can you give me one example of a thing you think I couldn't find a contradiction in? If I'm allowed to, if you're not allowed to make any base assumption about what somebody thinks, could you give me an example of two positions you think are hypocritical?
Well, you could say A equals not A.
No, but
right? I don't need to know a single fucking thing about anybody to know that A equals not A. Right? I don't need to then add other context to it.
Okay, what if I had the context that 1A is written capital and 1A is written lowercase? Therefore, you can have A equals not A.
Well, then you're no longer in the like. In
well, why
the
would you assume the? Why would you? Wait. Why would you assume the case?
Identity.
Why would you assume the case of each? You didn't say law of identity. You just said A equals A, or A can equal not A.
Yeah, sure. If you would prefer that I say the law of identity as opposed to A equals not A, like again, you're muddying again.
No, I'm not muddying. I'm just showing you.
What I'm talking about is no, you're not showcasing anything. A contradiction exists. You claim that there is hypocrisy, and then in order to try and
you just added extras. Do you see how you added extras? You gave me the example.
I didn't add a single new thing.
You said A can't equal not A.
You asked for an example.
You said A can't equal not A, and I'm saying, well, what if one is uppercase and one is lowercase? Boom. Now I've
A cannot equal not A is just a short-term way of describing the Aristotelian concept of the law of identity.
Sure, and I could invoke like paralogics or something if I wanted to.
The law of like excluded middle. Yeah, but you dragged it to this, right? I'm saying, where is the hypocrisy? And you're saying, well, what does he think about habeas corpus? Okay. If he makes a claim about habeas corpus in both of these instances and they contradict, then sure, you found hypocrisy. You found a contradiction. But you can't add a new element to try and invent hypocrisy. Like, you made the claim that he's a hypocrite, and then you extrapolated that into a conversation about how conservatives are hypocrites.
Stop saying I'm extrapolating onto conservatives. I said I haven't gotten nailed down on anything. Stop trying to do this extrapolating to conservatives. I said I'll talk only about Asmongold. But now you're claiming that I can't claim that he's inconsistent in his beliefs here because I can't assume that he believes that Americans are due process. If I can't make that assumption, then no, I can't prove that he. I don't know if he thinks Venezuelans are human. I haven't actually heard him say that. And if you're saying, well, I can't make that assumption, then I can't prove any statement of his being hypocritical or not. There's no way.
Whether or not, no, hold on. This is again. You're trying to make assumptions about what his positions are on.
I'm curious if we were to take a bet.
Wait.
Wait. Stop. If we were to bet, this is such a ridiculous claim. Oh my God.
No, you're sneaking in this concept that like maybe he doesn't believe they're human, which is
You're the one who's saying that he doesn't believe in due process.
Whether or not due process is something that you give
oh my God.
to someone
this is how this conversation
that is a green card holder that is suspected of terrorism, right? Is not the
he's
same
not
thing
suspected
as
of
due
terrorism.
process.
He's not suspected of terrorism. Why are you
suspected
saying
of
that?
engaging in terrorist activity.
He's not suspected of engaging in terrorist activity. The claim that I saw was that he was protesting in favor of Hamas. That's all I saw, and there haven't been any criminal charges or anything to support that.
So we can look at state statute, what is it, 1182, right? That discusses when someone is violated.
Who determines if you violate a statute?
Or listen to me, when someone is ineligible for green card status.
Who determines that?
Like I said, we can look at it. We can.
No, we don't. We don't determine
I'm not a lawyer.
You're
not a lawyer.
Doesn't a jury and a court system, don't you have due process for these determinations? Isn't there arbitration involved?
Again, whether or not, I believe that is probably
no. Why do you see how you're muddying the waters when you do this? I believe. I don't care what you believe. We're not talking about what you believe, but we don't make determinations based on what a governor says or what a president says. There's due process. You have to be charged with a crime, or there has to be some arbitration for this. Not just the president makes a tweet, now you're deported.
That is okay. So again. Right. I'm not muddying the waters by making a clarification of a distinction between my position and the position I'm arguing for. Right. So like that's silly. But moving forward, right, you are saying now that it is an assumption amongst all people that whether or not you can deport someone that is on a green card status, not a citizen, not someone that is either a temporary resident or someone that has some type of visa, right? That they have obligations to fulfill in order to be here as a guest in our nation. And you're saying that they have a right to a trial for deportation, but they're not being imprisoned, right? They're not going to jail. You don't need to charge a crime in order to say that I'm revoking
I understand what you're saying.
Status
but then who's to decide if they've actually done the thing that would have their green card revoked? Who decides that?
Again, this is
you're not going to answer that.
Where is the hypocrisy?
Right, can you just answer that? It's not a distraction.
From the claim that you made.
It's literally paramount. It's who decides if you've violated this. He's not going to answer this question. Okay.
Yeah. Why would I continue to answer a question that's an aside that is an escape route for you to? Because if it was common practice, accusing you of hypocrisy, and now you're saying, let me go through this other thing, and you make a claim of hypocrisy, and then you have to substantiate. I
already have fully substantiated it, but the only way that you've escaped that substantiation is by saying, I don't think Asmongold believes in due process for green card holders, which is a ridiculous statement.
It's not a ridiculous statement, number one. Number two, you said,
can you say, what do you think are the chances that Asmongold, doesn't support due process for green card holders? Can you just give me an estimate on that? What do you think is the percentage chance that Asmongold would say, I don't think that green card holders get due process in the United States?
So let me recap, and then I'll answer your question, right? So you asked me if there was any way in which there was consistent principles or beliefs in which there wasn't hypocrisy between these two domains. I gave you a fuck ton of evidence as to how these are completely disanalogous
examples. Didn't give any evidence at all.
And yes, I did. I absolutely did. I gave argument. You said there was a lot there.
You gave a whole bunch of accusations against the person, but you didn't actually substantiate who determines those allegations. You gave me a bunch of allegations about him supporting Hamas and about him engaging in terrorist activity but who determines that?
Hold on. That is not what's at question here. What is not at
at question.
No, you're interrupting.
If he was in a criminal court. If he got held liable for a crime or something.
Positions.
Okay.
You're interrupting again. Let me kick your ass again. Calm down for a moment, and then you can refute what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you're interrupting to try and go down this hole of due process. Now, that is a separate conversation that you and I can debate. We can have conversations about that, and we can maybe even extrapolate and guess what Asmongold thinks about that. But the question is there hypocrisy? You said, are there consistent principles between these? Then I gave you a bunch of ways in which those principles could exist. One of many examples that could be, right? Because you're saying, I can't see any way in which these are not hypocrisy. And then I give you examples of how they could not be hypocrisy. Okay. It is irrelevant as to whether or not the facts of Mahmoud Khalil's deportation, to either determined by a court or not, whether or not those facts remain to be true, whether or not he actually passed that out. That is the claim of the DOJ. Whether or not it is a fact that he spoke in front of Kuhad and lied and said that he wasn't, because I can just show you the video, right? So again, you're saying what is a position where there isn't hypocrisy? I give it to you, and you're distracting by saying that we need habeas corpus and a right to a trial. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but that is in no way, shape, or form evidence of his hypocrisy. It's a new position you're using to escape your argument.
Do you think that freedom of speech exists or can exist without due process? Or do you think that one of these things assumes the other?
I think freedom of speech is an ideal, right?
Can freedom of speech exist?
Negative right from the state.
Can you have the negative right of freedom of speech without the negative or positive, depending on right of due process?
I mean, I guess hypothetically you could.
Really? So again, if I can lock you up for any reason without putting you in front of a court, you think you can still have freedom of speech?
Again,
he's going to call it a distraction and not answer. Okay, I gotcha.
Well, no, it's two domains, right?
It's not.
One is yes, it is.
It's not. You like to do philosophy. You don't care about legal structure or anything. So it's just
I like to engage in
and
truth.
Pontificating. It's not truth. It's abstract. I like concepts that aren't related to anything that Asmongold or me are talking about. I'm not running anywhere. I'm right here. My original claim was that Asmongold is a broad definition of what the First Amendment is when criticizing Europe, but when it comes to the United States, he's willing to say that a lawful permanent resident can be deported without even being formally charged with a crime. There is no possible theory underlying conceptual foundation by which you can believe in freedom of speech that's so important that an American can tell a European country. This is what you've been doing the entire conversation. Who do you think's spoken more of this conversation? Just curious. You have by 3 times. Exactly. A gish gallop is when you named 50 different things that the State Department accused Khalil Mahmoud of doing that had nothing to do with the argument. That was a gish gallop, by the way, because you named 5 different things that had nothing to do with anything we're talking about, okay? That's great.
I don't think you know what a gish gallop is. It's not.
I know what a gish gallop is. Thank you. Okay.
No. It's when you make a string of accusations.
There's no
as opposed to a cohesive argument.
There's no foundational principled position that you can have that would allow you to criticize European countries for their lack of freedom of speech while supporting the deportation of a lawful permanent resident without any sort of due process. There is no consistent foundation by which you can do that, which is why I say his position is hypocritical.
Okay, so what is due process in this context, right? Because there are two different things, two different situations that we're discussing. And again, like you muddy the water with conservatives, like you muddy the water
at all.
with saying
very
that there's
willing to clarify. And I even told you why I use Asmongold as a stand-in for conservatives, because this is the standard conservative belief. And I said I would talk only about Asmongold, but you keep bringing up this bad argument over and over again because you think it strengthens your position, but that's fine.
Yeah. So again, when you're adding in this element of due process, which is not showcased or highlighted in the video, but you're saying it's important that the due process is.
I'm not. No, hold on. You're making this such a ridiculous conversation. No sane human being would ever make the argument that you have any freedom of speech without due process. These things go hand in hand with each other.
You have not let me critique what happened 2 minutes ago, right? What happened 2 minutes ago before you went on and accusing me of gish galloping and making these arguments, even though I'm making a cohesive argument. These are pieces of evidence that go into one argument as opposed to individuated arguments. There's the difference, right? So the cohesive argument here is that, one, you have to showcase hypocrisy in the words that you are stating. You're adding a new element of due process, which the video evidence that you're showing doesn't talk about whether or not there is a right to due process, number one. But maybe the greater context of the video does. I couldn't find the transcript. Maybe it does. And that would be interesting and maybe relevant, but not to the clip that you posted. Secondly, when you were talking about due process, you are equivocating between due process for people that are charged with a crime and that people then go to jail or are punished for said crime.
That's not
versus
true.
Whether or
there
not
is due
someone
process.
deserves,
I know that you're unaware of this, but there is due process. There is due process for people who are immigrants and have to be held for immigration
You're
hearings as well.
me.
Due process isn't just for people being charged with crimes necessarily. There's also due process for immigrants for hearings related to your immigration status.
You are equivocating the necessary element of charging with a crime versus whether or not a green card holder that is a guest in the country can be deported and whether or not they lose their status. These are two different things. Okay, if the Department of, the courts will have to decide this, obviously, right? Neither of us are lawyers. The question is whether or not Asmongold is a hypocrite and whether or not you're just like finding something spicy on Twitter and you're making bullshit arguments as opposed to actually having a substantive disagreement with what he's saying. That's the issue here, right? Because we both have different positions from Asmongold. The question about whether or not due process is the same for criminal acts and whether or not someone that is a green card, a guest in the country, is something entirely different. He doesn't need to be charged with a crime, right? Like maybe he does. I would take that back. Maybe he does need to be charged with a crime, and that's what the judges presume. But that is like 3 degrees of separation on whether or not Asmongold is a hypocrite on the concept of free speech when he thinks hate speech laws in Europe that are like people are getting arrested for tweets is the same thing as a representative for an organization that takes over private property violently, is accused, but you say he should have due process. I agree with that as well, but is accused by the Department of Justice of passing out terrorist literature and is not a citizen, is a green card holder.
So do you think Asmongold would agree with the argument that the government could accuse any green card holder of anything, and therefore that person could be deported without any sort of due process? Your answer is going to be, that's irrelevant. You're adding things.
Well, no. My answer, like, if I say it's irrelevant, you'll attack me for that. But then if I say that this is my position,
for the 25 tier 1 suburbs,
find a way to attack me on that.
I'm not. Wait. I'm never. I'm not
right,
asking
my
you.
Position
Wait.
They should have.
I'm not asking you your position. What did I just ask you?
You asked me, do I think that green card holders should have some level of due process?
I asked you, do you think Asmongold thinks should green card holders have some level of due process? Or do you think Asmongold would agree with the statement, anybody can be deported if the president accuses you of a crime as long as you're just a green card holder?
I don't know.
Okay, if you're not willing to engage in a real conversation and you're just trying to approach this like we're year one philosophy. No, this is a year 1 philosophy student of like, given the prompt, is there a hypocritical statement? We don't exist in that world. There's a whole body of Asmongold content and political views that I know he has, that Asmongold has, that he's not even going to deny having, that I know he has. And that's what I'm criticizing. I'm not including every single relevant supporting axiomatic statement. What am I lying about?
No, You're saying that this isn't a specific case when it is. We're talking about a video of him reacting to Mahmoud Khalil. We're not talking about what he feels in terms of like Venezuelan trend.
Yes, of course. That's all being
level
called.
Of evidence
what do you
is
think?
necessary
Yes,
for
of
that,
course. That's being called into part of the analysis, part of the hypocrisy. Is of course is his position on all of these things. Yeah.
You're not showcasing hypocrisy by adding new things and then having us guess on what his
nobody
positions
has
are
to
on
guess.
So that
everybody understood exactly what was being said. No, there's nobody disagrees that Asmongold holds any of these positions whatsoever. This is just you because you're having.
What are you talking about?
Asmongold.
So no one disagrees that Asmongold has a specific position on the right of habeas corpus in all examples.
Nobody disagrees that Asmongold would say that if you're an immigrant, you can't just be tossed out of the country because the president accuses you of something. I'm sure he would never take a position saying that that's the case.
Okay, right, but does that, sure, you believe that, I don't know that, but that's probably true, right? Like, it's a pretty safe assumption, right? So again, there is a substantive difference between the specific case that you were saying is hypocrisy. Now, again, you love to do this apparently. You're generalizing it to his position on all of these other things. We now have to guess what his position is on Venezuelan, deportation of Tren de Agua.
What do you mean? To make a claim of hypocrisy, to some extent, I have to individualize, or I have to generalize, because if I give a special case for everything, then this goes back to my initial argument that nobody's hypocrisy about anything.
You're saying A and B are two hypocritical positions, and then you're adding C into it to prove the hypocrisy. The fuck are you talking about? That's insane. Like, there is a specific case that we are talking about. We are not talking about all forms of other things. We are not, like, I am not a legal scholar. You are not a legal scholar. Asmongold clearly isn't a
Is he trolling? No, he's doing
what we are talking
he's just
about
interpreting these two single statements in a vacuum, and by the language of the two statements, he's trying to say that these two things.
Fucking pay attention.
Well, because I already said how this entire argument would go down before we even spoke, and it's exactly what I thought it was. It's a waste of time. All you're doing is you're taking the text of both of these statements, and then you're analyzing strictly the text of both of these statements, and you're trying to see if we can find like a logic, like capital logic, hypocritical thing between these two statements. And the answer is going to be
I'm looking.
Yes, but now you're going to say, well, I'm
looking for hypocrisy.
No. But you're looking for hypocrisy.
Not add new shit.
No one is adding new shit. We're having these in the context.
You have been this entire conversation.
We're having these in the context of the political beliefs that this person has, and I'm appealing to the hypocrisy that he has relating to his political beliefs and the political ideas that he presents on his stream. Not, can I take these two statements, present them in a vacuum to a year one philosophy student, and see if we can do some propositional logic on them to find a contradiction or not. That nobody's engaged in that secondary thing. If you want to engage in the secondary thing, that's fine. But literally nobody's doing this. Nobody cares about this.
All right. So let's back away from this. I would say that you have failed in the ability to show the hypocrisy or the contradiction. But regardless, we're both tired of this, and it seems like we're going in circles because you won't admit to my framing and vice versa, right? So let's now separate from the Asmongold critique, right, and move into like your third tweet response to me, right, where you said this is your real argument as opposed to like the argument against Asmongold, which is that conservatives as a large group or institution are hypocritical because they have hyper specific things when it's on speech that they like, and that they have hyper broad things when it's things that they don't like, right? So for example, you brought up the Twitter files as an example of like things that they don't like, where you're saying a private company is doing that, and you brought up the idea of like chilling effect in that regard. Where I'm curious as to how you substantiate that, or how that's different from the left, how that is like a right specific thing as opposed to just a general thing of people in politics, is that they tend to be in that they tend to be in that vein, that's how normies are. Why is that a right-wing thing?
Why is it a right-wing thing that I think that they're hypocritical in terms of what they would defend and what they won't defend for speech?
Yeah, well, so when you move away from the Asmongold critique, right, and you say this is my real argument, I have an issue with, because then you went into like January 6th, and I was like, that has nothing to fucking do, like this is just whataboutism. You're like, hey, no, here's my real argument. My real argument
how is what I'm doing whataboutism when you're asking me to talk about the Democratic side of things when I'm just critiquing the Republican side of things? Isn't that definitionally, you're just looking for hypocrisy now instead of actually wondering if my statement is true or not? No?
Well, the conversation is about hypocrisy. I'm saying that your critique is of the right. I don't necessarily disagree once we get into the domain of the right and there are all these different factions, but I'm saying, why are you bringing this up as like a critique against the right as opposed to just recognizing that this is how normies on Twitter are? Like, do you have a specific like example or thing that you think that this is a problem specifically on the right?
I think that, yes, I think that the right,
muddying the waters.
I think the right is specifically, I think that the right specifically has an issue with this because the right, more than the left, on a number of issues, seems to significantly change their mind depending upon whose behavior is being spoken about, basically implicated.
So you have a positive position, which is that, I mean, I guess you're talking about Trump, maybe. I don't know. I mean, is that fair?
Well, I don't want to give an example. Like I can give examples, but I feel like if I give examples, you're going to say I'm muddying the waters again. So I don't know. Yes, but I'm talking about MAGA in general. When I'm talking about conservative, I'm talking about MAGA.
No. It's like, I don't think giving examples is muddying the water or gish galloping so long as it comes to a central point in your argument, which is not what you were doing before. It's muddying the waters when you use it to subvert from the argument.
Gotcha. Well, you couldn't understand earlier because you were looking at it as a year one high school philosophy student trying to do prop logic on two statements completely disconnected from the rest of a person's body of work. But I understand that was the type of argument you wanted to engage in. That's just not what anybody else, I think, in my Twitter sphere is arguing about. No,
I'm just trying to get you to, substantiate your claim.
Yeah, okay. I'm trying to get you to understand what the argument is, which isn't a basic prop logic analysis between two different statements. But
well, no, the argument is mine, which is that I think it was a bullshit hypocrisy, and I wanted you to substantiate it.
Yeah, but I didn't know that you were saying bullshit hypocrisy as per defined as a year one prop logic analysis of the two statements by just their text without taking into account anything else.
These jabs aren't like actually like.
I'm only jabbing back when you're jabbing. So if you want to keep jabbing, we can go back and forth on that. I don't care. Yeah, if you want to keep saying
but it's like you're not saying. Right, you're not saying anything, but it's
I
fine.
am saying something. I'm saying that the analysis that you're engaged in is boring and nobody cares about it, and clearly nobody thought that was the analysis that I was engaged in, but you wanted to engage in the analysis, so that's the only point you can actually defend. So.
Well, yeah. Well, no, I think it's the truth.
I expected it like a political conversation, not a prop logic conversation. If we would have started with by analyzing, if the argument would have been, if we analyze the logic of the two statements, text alone, divorced from any other statement any other party has made, is there hypocrisy here? Then I would say, oh, by that definition, no. But that's literally not what anybody talks about ever when we're talking about hypocrisy, me included.
So let's extrapolate. Right?
Sure.
You right. So you want to get out of the domain of logic, right? You're saying he's a
again another jab by saying that I'm being irrational or out of the domain of logic. No, I'm getting out of the domain of formal analysis of prop logic of just two statements. You understand that there are broader arguments to be made that isn't just the analyzing of text in two different statements, right?
Yeah, no, I'm saying you can still make logical, valid arguments. I'm saying getting out of the domain of logic. I mean, specifically attacking it from like its logical consistency and just going into the ideas, right? So going into the ideas, you're from the political philosophy standpoint, you're saying that Asmongold and the right more often has an inconsistent worldview on freedom of speech. Right, that they're for freedom of speech in one domain and they're against freedom of speech in other domains. And you think that this specific example is anti-free speech in some regard. Why do you believe that? In order for there, if that's where your critique is, why is it anti-free speech to deport a green card holder or to say that we ought to get rid of people like that?
Because I think that typically when you're taking action against people that have already earned some sort of U.S. recognition, like visa or lawful permanent residence, when you're making these decisions in a way that doesn't seem to be viewpoint neutral, then it feels like what you are making these decisions based on is the speech of the party, and the speech of the party, if you're deciding to deport somebody based on their speech, their viewpoint, then that feels like anti-freedom of speech to me.
So, but the argument isn't right that Trump. I mean, Trump says stupid shit, right? All the goddamn time, right? So, but you're saying that it feels like it is biased in its selection, right? Because Trump is more pro-Israel and he's getting rid of anti-Palestinian protesters, right?
Well, I'm saying, wait. I'm saying that the deportation claim here doesn't appear to be viewpoint neutral. It appears to be based on the political persuasion of the individual, which I would argue, and the Supreme Court obviously would agree, is not freedom of speech. Because you're making, when I say viewpoint neutral, I mean that the decision isn't being made based on a crime being committed or anything else. It's just being made based on the viewpoint of the speaker.
Okay, so you're saying that we could be following deportation laws as they are. But because he's choosing to exercise those deportation laws against an individual that is politically against him in some way, that this is anti-free speech?
If that's the basis on which he's exercising these laws, yes.
Well, the basis upon which he's exercising these laws, what do you mean by that? His belief system, his bias, et cetera? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's a political point of view. He's a huge supporter of Israel, and these people were huge supporters of, I guess, Hamas or Palestine, and therefore, because of that, now they're going to be deported because of that.
So in a world where media narratives and 24-hour news cycles, right? I don't know whether or not Trump is consistent. It wouldn't surprise me if he wasn't, right? Consistently deporting like violent right-wing green card protesters. I don't know that they're like, I don't know. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head.
I can't think of examples of like protesters with green cards, but I know for the J6 people, for instance, he pardoned all of those people. So it seems like, and those were people that were accused of and committed crimes. So it seems like we have some viewpoint issues here in terms of who he's supporting and who he's being against. But
well, those are right. But there's obviously substantive differences there, right? Obviously you could call out the bias. You could have like a certain, hatred for J6, insurrectionists, etc. But you could still recognize that one group are citizens, and we're talking about a pardon and a belief system that these people had already.
Yeah, but they weren't pardoned. But you remember the question was about
unfairly.
The question was about viewpoint,
right? But that's not the same thing as green card.
I understand that, but the question was about viewpoint. J6 pardons weren't done because they were citizens. They were done because they shared his viewpoint.
Well, I mean, I don't know that they were done specifically because they shared his viewpoint. I'm sure that had something to do with it.
Right,
but I
really?
think that he had a belief that they were unjustly persecuted by the previous administration.
But you're not willing, hold on, wait, I just need to hear you say it. You're not willing to admit that the J6 pardons were done because they shared a viewpoint with Donald Trump?
I don't know I don't know whether or not that is true or not, right? Like I wouldn't do a univariate analysis, but I mean, even still, like I'm sure it has some overlap. But what do you think
was the driving factor? No, wait. If we're not, because we're not going to live in reality. What do you think was the driving, motivating factor?
I'm not living in anti-reality. I'm saying he has a belief about the way that they were punished. That doesn't necessarily mean that he did it because they shared a specific viewpoint with him.
Didn't he literally say that they were unfairly prosecuted?
Relevant.
It's super relevant, and this would be like
look. We can just say, look, it doesn't matter. For argument's sake, let's say that's exactly why.
Okay.
Right? He did it because they're right-wing protesters that agree with him.
Gotcha.
Right? And that's why he did it. It didn't even have anything to do with like his belief that they were unfairly punished or whatever, right? It's purely just because they're right-wing protesters.
Yes.
He's like, I like that shit. I'm going to pardon you.
Okay.
There's still a substantive difference between a green card holder, right, and a pardon for U.S. citizens that have served some level of time in either in jail or in fines, et cetera, right? Like these are obviously two different things, right? So the thing that I'm saying is that if we're trying to find hypocrisy or this chilling effect, right, like you're really, really stretching that. Like the chilling effect here is that
do you think that green card holders don't have rights
accused
in the United States? Do you think they don't have like First Amendment rights or anything, or?
It depends. I mean, what position do you want me to take? An internal critique or my own, right?
Well, no, legally in the United States right now, we're illegally. Do you think that green card holders don't have First Amendment rights in the United States of America?
They do and they don't, right? They have freedom of speech and legally, right? But they also have, pursuant to the green card application, they do have things that they can't say and behaviors that they can't engage in, right?
Okay.
So that was the state statute 1182.
Sure.
So sure, they have that right, but then there are things that they're disqualified from.
Correct.
Certain activities.
So unless it's specifically called out, we would say that this is probably a right that's afforded to them, right? Except for in cases where there might be a specific carve out in law. We would say they do have First Amendment privileges in the United States, unless it's like specifically called out in some law or something.
Unless it's, yeah. I mean, like there's a lot of fucking laws that deal with this. Even 1182 is like fucking like 100 pages if you go to house.gov. If you want to look at like the disqualifying terrorism stuff, you want to Control F for like representative. That's where you'll find most of that stuff. But yeah. So like that, I'm fine with that. You would assume that they have some First Amendment right, legally speaking. Again, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and my theory on rights is natural rights, right? Not pursuant to the state. But yeah, that's fine. So you're like, in order to say like the media highlights this specific example, right? The media always loves a Trump scandal, and Trump gives them out like fucking daily, like candy, right? And so the claim is that Asmongold or that conservatives in general are hypocritical for being for the deportation of a green card holder. And then we get into this domain of like, well, it's the habeas corpus. Do they have a right to a trial to prove these things? Or is it a chilling effect that the president can make accusations and that the Department of Justice can make accusations and then kind of like deport them without some form of trial, and that then extrapolates to every green card holder that wants to protest peacefully? Is that the argument there?
I guess, sure. To be clear, just on one quick thing, like due process doesn't have to necessarily mean like a criminal trial. There could be some other sort of arbitration, like immigration courts. But okay, sure, okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, like due process due process is going to be defined by like a whole fucking like so much common law, right? And it's going to be dependent upon the situation in general, right? So the mere accusation is wrong. Now that's been stopped by the courts, right? And so like I guess if your critique is not of Asmongold, right, but your critique is of those elements of the right that are like super fashy.
I don't know how wait, just real quick. I don't know why we keep going back and forth with this. The reason why I critique Asmongold is because I feel like he embodies all of those viewpoints of the right. That if you watch his content,
where's your evidence?
If you watch his content, he's constantly
that he embodies the.
Because if you watch his content, he overwhelmingly agrees that he. I'm sorry, I don't know if we have a lag or thing.
Well, no, I'm just saying. Like, do you have any evidence that he disagrees with any form of due process for anyone, and that like a claim is enough, or do you just kind of vibe it? Like you think that there's like a certain vitriol on one side.
I don't think.
Like, you know what I mean? Like,
no, I don't think that he would have that thing. I think he would say that some due process is important, which is why I made the appeal to hypocrisy, because I think if this was a different type of issue, I think that he would have a different position on it. If somebody said, we're going to deport immigrants who were protesting in favor of the stolen immigration theory, and we're going to say that their protests were supporting the J6 protesters who were a violent group, and now we're going to start deporting them, I think conservatives would all of a sudden become incredibly First Amendment conscientious, saying that, no, you have a right to protest and blah, 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 blah. That's where the hypocrisy claim comes from.
I don't disagree that some segment of the right would have that opinion.
Just to be clear, we massively disagree if that's your statement, because I don't think it would be some portion. I think it would be a vast majority, like 70% plus would have this position of MAGA. But just to be clear. So
you think 70% position, of MAGA, so MAGA is already like a portion of the...
MAGA is like 90% of the right, I would say. It's the people who voted for Trump, basically.
So what do you... Okay, so you would define MAGA as the people who voted for Trump, which is what, like 40% of the country?
Yeah, I guess I'm defining it because
42 or something.
Sure, I'm defining it that way so that when we say conservative, we don't just mean like conservative beliefs worldwide or something like that. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no, I disagree. I disagree, but I have as much evidence as you do, right? Which is like not very much, right? That like 90% of everyone that voted for Donald Trump would radically shift from the perspective of like green card holders don't need due process if they're accused of violent crimes. But then if we put the shoe on the other foot, let's say pro-Israel, well, actually pro-Israel is a bad idea because that's kind of special because a lot of right-wingers hate Israel.
Sure, my evidence for that, I would just point to a ton of other positions that they'll take completely contrary views on, depending on if it's right or left, and I would just extrapolate it to this pretty simply, and I could probably run through thought experiments with any conservative.
Right. But when you say they, right, like
MAGA.
The right isn't a monolith, the left isn't a monolith. MAGA's not a monolith.
MAGA is monolithically in support of everything Trump says. Yes, it's one of the big problems we have right now in this country, of the major positions. So your evidence of the hypocrisy is that you believe that the MAGA are sycophants that would simply go along with what Trump says, regardless of the circumstances. And that's your argument? Like this is so many degrees of separation of you like proving some hypocrisy. It sounds like you're just making accusations and oversimplifications against the right, which is what I accused you of doing in the beginning, because I said that that's just a bullshit critique and that you're not actually making a substantive claim. And then I think that these cases are wildly different and you can disagree, which I said in my original post, with deporting Mahmoud Khalil. And I said that you could disagree with like him not getting trial, right? That's the very first thing I said is you can disagree with the deporting and recognize that these are substantively different cases, that praying outside of an abortion clinic or mean tweets is not the same thing as the Department of Justice claiming that someone has terrorist links, is passing out terrorist literature. We've seen them call for violence to violent groups. They were a representative for a group that took over private property and that they were formerly members of UNRWA and that this is someone that they want to get rid of because don't apply to him, so I don't know why we just added all that stuff. But
all of those things apply to Mahmoud Khalil. Which is the case we're talking about.
Yeah, but these are just things that have been said. Like there's no. process by way, like this goes back to an argument. It's like, or my argument is that without due process,
it doesn't matter what they're saying. You're saying they're hypocritical for these things, right? Like I already said again that you could agree that he deserves a trial. You could agree that like the deportation is necessarily wrong. But what I'm saying is that these are wildly different cases, and calling this out is like hypocrisy because conservatives or Asmongold
disagree
are
that they're
against
wildly
mean
different.
tweets going to jail
I don't disagree.
versus what they consider to be violent protesters.
I don't disagree that these are different cases, but I'm making a prediction for what their position would be if the person was protesting a different type of idea. That's the whole point.
Right, so you're vibing out what you think they would be in a different situation.
Yeah, welcome to political analysis. It's not just all prop logic analysis of simple statements. This is not the world of politics where you just here's a question, and I know you're not going to answer because you're going to say it's not relevant.
Right?
The question is
silly.
No, it's not hypocritical. As in, can we find some logical disunion between the text of two statements? Nobody speaks that way in the real world. I'm sorry, but here's a question:
No, that's
is there
one
a single?
of the domains of argument. I proved you wrong in that.
You didn't prove me wrong there.
General.
You proved that you weren't able to follow the conversation. Can you give me a single example where you feel like the Republicans have broken from Trump in a significant way, besides the vaccine, I guess?
Okay, so besides the big thing that they were against on that, and
because I would argue with you there. The reason why they broke with him on the vaccine was because of his other bad information on the disease and stuff. I would say they were following him, but it was a statement that he issued prior to the vaccine being released. So besides that, can you give a single thing where they've broken with Trump on?
Yeah, so I think most of MAGA was pretty upset when he did that deal with OpenAI and connected those. I think they're right, like when he had said that there was, what was it, like 50 billion or something. They're very upset about that. I think there are tons and tons of
who was upset about this? What? Give me a single large conservative figure that was upset about this.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, give me a second. I'm not here. Wasn't necessarily looking for OpenAI deal Trump. Let's see if we can find some stuff on the $500 billion in AI investment. So let me see if we can do a search through like X or something on OpenAI, Oracle, and SoftBank. Probably just find something. So we'll go to the search. Advanced search, we're looking for any of these words. And then we'll put them in quotes. Sorry, give me just a second. I'm looking for you so we can see exactly which big guys were upset. Let's see. X search function sucks these days anyways. Fuck, it's my people. I wouldn't even
more
libertarian.
Sure, and I wouldn't even say this isn't even like a big issue. Like of all the things that Trump has done, like this one thing is not even like a huge talking point. But I don't remember any.
Mike Benz was pretty upset about it, right? That's the guy that like is the big USAID guy on the right after his Joe Rogan stuff. Let's see who else mentions it. Danny Can Talk, right? He has an issue with it. Oh, that's one of my people. I thought he was bigger than that. Let's see. Dude, my algorithm is full of so many fucking libertarians, right? Ian Carroll, right? But obviously you would you think that he's outside of like MAGA because he's too like anti-Israel or something? OpenAI, nope, that's something else. Looks like, see if I can find the rabbit hole on it.
Do you not think that Trump pushes like a sort of like rabid devotion to him in a way that's pretty unique in politics over the past?
Yeah, it's like Undoomed. It's like he's only got like 70K followers. Yeah, I mean, like we can move on to a different example if you want. It's fine. I mean, like I'm not finding a ton of it. This was off the top of my head. Like, what is something pissed people off? This is what I remember. Maybe it's because I'm in more of a libertarian space. It's mostly libertarians pissed off about it.
Sure. I would say that probably the biggest issue, the biggest divide recently was probably on the H-1B stuff, but even that basically went away and nobody's changed their position on Trump as a result of it. I think that Trump probably demands a more sycophantic like obsession and more like ideological orthodoxy among his followers than any other politician, even in the conservative movement, but especially on the liberal or leftist side. Like I think that's a pretty.
Well, I don't know about demands, but
demands. When I say demands, I mean that
passively, yeah.
No, actively, as in like if like if a news reporter says something mean about him, he'll tweet that person needs to be fired, or if a politician goes against him, he'll say that person needs to be primaried and kicked out of the party, or
right, like Thomas Massey, right, for not going along with his spending bills, right, because like
or any news reporter that says anything mean about him or questions him on anything like critical, like all of these statements are.
Yeah, so I mean, like I do think that MAGA has obviously had instances where they've been pissed off at Trump, but I do agree that there is a cult of personality and a little bit more of like a sycophant kind of relationship between a populist candidate, obviously, right, and who's a president, as opposed to some of the more boring kind of candidates we've had in the past. And that conversation does get a little less, has been a little bit more radical, and there has been more tribalism, right? But I fail to see the connection that, you're saying they're hypocritical on free speech, and specifically, and we can get out of the case of Mahmoud Khalil because like the case is just so egregious that like if all the things the DOJ says are true, it's kind of like an open and shut case. That
well, hold on. If that was let's just say for 1 second, if that was a U.S. citizen, would anything they have done been wrong?
Well, I mean, I think it probably would be like misdemeanor crimes, right? Like, because obviously, like taking over public property, like there was like instances where people were like, like getting yelling.
Let's say that I even grant you that, and I don't know if he was personally implicated in this, but let's say that I grant you that. Or go ahead, hold on.
Well, yeah. Well, the other thing that like it would certainly merit investigation if you have someone that is, speaking at these events. That's certainly like I think they might be interested with his connections with UN. Was it WRA, RWA? I can never remember the acronym. It's fine.
Sure.
Let's say what you just intelligence said. Sure. It could be these other things.
Let's say that what you just said
would require investigations.
Yeah. Let's say that what you just said was true. Okay. And let's say that we would qualify for misdemeanor crimes. Okay. Let's say that was true, and let's say we could even get convicted on it. Not that he has to be, but let's say he could. Do you think the idea of deporting somebody for what's essentially a misdemeanor crime, if they're a green card holder, does that bode well, or does that bode incredibly poorly for the concept of freedom of speech in the United States?
I think it has very limited impact because of the specifics of the case, right? I mean, there's
not the specifics of this case. I'm saying broadly speaking, if you could deport somebody for what you're saying are essentially misdemeanor crime. Go ahead.
Right. So again, like the state abuses its authority all the fucking time.
I'm not asking for a libertarian analysis.
Stop interrupting me and let me make the position or the claim and answer your question, I should say. So again, if we go through an investigation and we find that he has terrorist links and that he's pushing out, Hamas literature, and that he's, potentially has other links or, is soliciting funding or something like that could be a much, much more serious thing, but that would require an investigation. If you could deport someone purely for, let's say, jaywalking and, I don't know, keying a Tesla once, et cetera. The question is would that have some large chilling effect? That's a psychological thing, right? Like the measurement of chilling effect.
Hold on, wait. I'm not talking
psychological
about,
in nature.
I don't know if you meant keying a Tesla because it was specifically the Tesla brand, but I'm talking about a non-viewpoint neutral law where I could come out and say, I support the IDF, you're fine. I support the UK, you're fine. I support Ukraine, you're fine. I support Hamas, you're out of here. That's not a viewpoint neutral assessment of who should be deported from this country. Don't you think that is a bad thing for the concept of the freedom of speech?
So you're saying that it's bad that some organizations that are terrorist organizations would be labeled a terrorist organization for the purposes of revoking green card status. That would be negative for the country if we started deporting people from our country that are guests here because the United States or the intelligence apparatus, et cetera, had determined that they had links to terrorist organizations.
Stop. Wait. You're mixing. You're mixing so much in here. Links to terrorist organizations is way different than just protests in favor of.
Okay. Sorry. So not necessarily a link to terrorist organizations, just supporting terrorist organizations as a green card holder.
Sure.
That it would have a chilling effect if they were supporting terrorist organizations.
Yes.
And so we got to make sure that we don't deport people for supporting, let's say, ISIS when they're invited here as guests and they write a contract.
I don't know why you keep saying invited here as guests.
That.
They're lawful permanent residents. They've gone through a process. They're not just here by invitation. But
well, like presumably, right? Like I'm more open borders, right, than the
I'm
right.
not talking about open borders or anything. I'm just saying it's weird to say invited here as a guest. Maybe you can make that argument for a visa holder, maybe, but they're lawful permanent residents. They've got green cards. It's an extensive process to qualify for that.
But they're not citizens, right?
Well, why wouldn't you say a citizen is here as a guest? If a lawful permanent, I mean, they can go through a process as well to become a citizen, right? That's your
there's a distinction between being granted citizenship and distinction between lawful permanent
but as a
residence,
citizen, if a green card holder is just a guest, then why isn't somebody who applies for and gains citizenship, why aren't they also a guest? What?
Well, okay, so because there are differences in the behavior and things that change whether or not a green card holder versus a citizen, can lose their status. A citizen.
That's tautological. I'm not asking you what the law is. I'm asking you why there ought to be a philosophical distinction between this word guest. This isn't a word found in law. This is just a word you're using. I'm just curious why you're calling a green card holder a guest, but like a citizen.
I'm using the word guest because their status in the country is pursuant to an agreement that they made, right? So a guest comes into your home, right? And the moment that a guest comes into your home and they start acting wild, acting a fool, they refuse to take their shoes off, whatever it is, you can kick them out of your home. But if someone is living in your home and has signed the lease, right, then that's a little different.
Do you think that a green card holder is more akin to signing a lease or is more akin to just a guest in your home? Keep in mind the name is lawful permanent resident. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, I'll continue the analogy a little better, right? So let's say a visa holder would be like a guest that's not on the lease, right?
Sure.
And then a green card holder would be someone that is on the lease, right? And then you, the citizen, would be the owner of the home. You as the owner of the home can't just be kicked out of your home unless you violate like some crazy crime and you go to jail, right? You go murder somebody for some reason. But the guest, if you will, if you want to say like it's not a guest, it's a green card holder, you don't like that word, that's fine, right? But the green card holder, if he violates the lease, right? Because he signed an agreement that he would behave and do certain things to be there, now we can evict that person. Now, you see what I'm saying? So there obviously would be a difference between a citizen and a green card holder here. And that difference is that a green card holder has certain actions that they're not allowed to engage in and has certain things that they need to do in order to maintain their status.
Yeah. So I think it's not the worst analogy ever, but I think that I would say that a citizen is somebody who owns their home. And I would say a lawful permanent resident is probably somebody who has like a mortgage, right? Because once you're a lawful permanent resident, you have it forever unless you do one of, a handful of actions that can get it revoked. And generally, LPR is your journey to citizenship. So, and again,
well, not all of us are millionaires with mortgages. Okay, most of us are renters in poor destiny. All right.
Sure, just an analogy.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine, but the problem is that the reason I'm using a lease is because there are certain behaviors and rules that you can't break that would not apply to a citizen.
Sure,
right? There are ways in which you can lose your green card.
Yeah, I agree with that.
This is potentially one of them.
Sure, I think that it would be okay if those behaviors were limited to the narrow subset of behaviors that we would probably imagine this act was created for. So, for instance, providing material support for terrorist groups is probably a thing that...
Well, no. Like you can disagree with the law, right? But like if you read 1182... let me.
I know you're going to do the super narrow reading of the law. I understand.
No. I'm not going to do a super narrow. I promise.
You are. I'm familiar with the law. I know. I'm familiar with the law. I understand. We've read it as well, right?
Okay. Well, for the audience's sake, right? Yeah. They give an example of what would be considered engaging in terrorist activity to make it clearer, right? Mm-hmm. To just kind of give you an example. And the example they give is an alien who is an officer, official, representative, or spokesman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization is considered, for purposes of this chapter, to be engaged in terrorist activity. Mm-hmm. Now, when we're talking about Muhammad Khalil, right, we're talking about someone who is a representative for this group who is accused. We don't know for sure.
Wait a second. Hold on. Wait. First of all, wait, real quick.
Passing out Hamas literature.
Yeah.
Literature.
So I think that the issue that you run into is when this law was created, the concept of what a terrorist was a lot more narrow in that we typically weren't referring to state actors. So if we were to apply this as the law was written, where you have like somebody supporting, like Al-Qaeda or something like that.
Well, no, they give an example. Use Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. Hamas is obviously worse than PLO,
but PLO wouldn't apply anymore. So that I'm guessing this law was written in the 60s or 70s. When was it written? If the PLO is called out.
Text contains I don't know when this specific clause of it was written,
if it's calling out the PLO when they were a terrorist organization, sure. If it was probably that example, my guess is that example is coming from the 60s or 70s when the PLO was legitimately just a terrorist organization, right? But
that's a guess. But even the PLO, when they're engaged in the Black September in Lebanon and when they're trying to kill people in Jordan, right? Let's take the most extreme example. I don't know why you're saying it probably is that, but
stop. Okay,
maybe it is. Right?
I didn't even finish my reason. Okay, the issue that we run into today is that there are groups that are designated as terrorist groups that are also the de facto governments of places, and that's a significant problem because now if
that would be PLO and Hamas as well, right? They would both be that under almost all of PLO's time, they would be comparable to Hamas as de facto representatives of the government, right? So the example they give is one that meets the criteria that you're saying. So there's no contradiction. There's no issue.
I don't agree with that. I think that.
What do you mean you don't agree with that? As a PLO, who was in charge? Like, was this written like right after the Nakba?
Well, that's why no, it wouldn't have been because the PLO I don't think formed until the 60s. That's why I'm asking if this was in the 60s or earlier. But the reason why
they would have been the representatives the entire time for the Palestinians in those negotiations.
Okay.
So it just doesn't apply, right?
Yeah, I don't know. What other? Yeah, I don't know. He has no desire to. I don't know what to say. Yeah, I hope that you guys keep the same energy. The example that I'm giving you won't let me finish. I'm just going to keep talking until I get my whole point out. The example that I'm giving you is that right now we have an issue where state actors are designated terror groups. Okay, if somebody were to say, I'm going to designate the IDF as a terror group, I think that rightfully there are people in this country that go, well, hold on, can I not even protest in support of Israel without being claimed to support terrorism because the IDF is Israel's official military arm? And I think that they would have a good argument there. I would say, well, it seems like it would be a misuse of this act to criminalize or at least make deportation worthy, the idea of protesting in support of an entire state. In Gaza, the state, the administrative body for Gaza, the Gaza Strip, is Hamas. So it's interesting that Hamas, the state government of the Gaza Strip, can be entirely declared as a terrorist group because that means you basically cannot protest in support of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip without being worried about being deported. And I think that anybody that actually cares about freedom of speech or the concept of protest or protesting the people in power, which is what the First Amendment was written for, was arguably there to protect more than anything else at all, can now be deported for protesting in support of a state of people because that state is also declared arbitrarily by the executive, by the way, because they can declare anybody a terrorist, as a terrorist group. I think that is problematic. I think that line of logic is incredibly simple and easy to follow. And I think that anybody that thinks that freedom of speech is important, especially viewpoint neutral laws like deporting people because they've done a bad act, not just because of who they support, that's an important concept to protect. That people shouldn't be deported just for supporting a state that the government doesn't currently like. That's my point.
Okay, so would you consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization? Yes or no?
For the purposes of this law, no. For the purposes of this law, no.
So Destiny does not believe that Hamas is a terrorist organization.
Are you really going for clips? What do you think the age of consent should be if there's no government? Like, we can play for clips if you want. The problem is Hamas a terrorist organization? What a terrorist organization even is. What a terrorist organization even is. What a terrorist organization even is it's not even like a thing that's internationally like rigidly defined. Okay? Does Hamas commit terrorist?
No, I agree.
Does Hamas commit terrorist acts? Yes, of course they do. And I'm not going to sit here and say that they don't. Would I call them terrorists? I probably have. But insofar as would I consider them a terrorist group for protesting? Well, probably not. That's the de facto government of the Gaza Strip, and it seems weird to label people that protest in support of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip as terrorists that can be deported from the country. I think and that's not a viewpoint neutral distinction. There's
a lot here, right? So
no, it's pretty simple.
Your claim is right. No. You can. Is it impossible to, let's say, protest in support of Palestinian liberation, if you will, right, as a phrase, without supporting Hamas? Is that possible?
It might be. Theoretically, it is. But would I rely on the government to make that distinction?
Hold on. Theoretically, I cannot go grab a sign that says "Free Palestine, fuck Hamas."
You could.
I can't think Hamas is bad for Palestine.
You could do that, yeah.
Right. So you don't need to protest in support of any specific state government in order to support the liberation of its people out of war.
You don't need to do that. But if the government has made supporting Hamas a deportable offense, am I going to risk championing the state of Hamas, which is what the Gaza Strip is? Why would you risk that? How can that not have an incredibly chilling effect on speech and what people feel comfortable protesting if they're lawful permanent residents?
Right. So this is the issue. You know, the very issue that you accused conservatives of is what you're doing now, right? Which is the broad interpretation of the concept of chilling effect. Right. You're saying that there's a chilling effect that if the government deports someone that's handing out Hamas material, that assuming the accusations are true. Right?
Oh, no, wait, hold on. Let me just hear this. Wait, hold on. Wait. Yeah, I understand. This is my question.
Wait. I'll wrap it up. I'll wrap it up in a nice little bow, right? You're saying that if they deport someone that is, handing out material directly from Hamas propaganda, right, that they are engaged in destruction or control of private property, right, and that they are a representative in those, and that they lose their green card status, that there will be a chilling effect on other people doing nonviolent protests.
I don't know why you're adding violent. I'm not answering your question because you keep adding things. Violent, nonviolent, that's not what we're talking about. It has nothing to do with the laws written. Can you acknowledge you just added that for no reason?
Yes, it absolutely does. I added it for a very distinctive reason.
Wait. So are you claiming that if they were supporting Hamas in forms of protest, but they weren't violent, that this current act wouldn't allow for them to be deported?
No, I'm claiming that those are two separate things that would both be bad.
Okay, wait, we're not talking about things that are bad. That's not a question. I'm asking you, would you be allowed to be deported? No. Would you be deported if you supported Hamas in a nonviolent protest under the current law? Would you be deported if you supported Hamas in a nonviolent protest under the current law?
I'm going to explain in context.
Wait, say yes or no, and then explain in context. Say yes or no, and then explain in context.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So the violent, nonviolent doesn't matter. Yeah.
Right. The violent, nonviolent does matter. And the reason that it matters is that when you are claiming a specific case that has those elements, right, the violent thing is a disqualifying thing for their green card, and so would the Hamas
But the violent thing is not disqualifying.
Thing for their green card.
The violent thing would not be disqualifying. If I protested in a violent protest supporting BLM and I was a lawful permanent resident, would I get deported? No. So it's not. So the violent thing doesn't matter at all.
Well, hold on.
That's why it's not viewpoint neutral.
Or do you know that for a fact, or are you just saying
yes,
that
because the Aliens Act only calls out for acts of terrorism or supporting terrorist groups. It's not about, you can't get deported for misdemeanors in the United States. That's an insane proposition, and everybody should agree with that.
Well, there's a couple of distinctions here, right? So I don't know whether or not that is illegal, but that is still a substantive difference when you were talking about opinion, right? When you're talking about whether or not somebody is hypocritical in
we're not talking about the hypocritical thing. We're only talking about the chilling effect. No. Okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask my question because you're trying to avoid the chilling effect.
And the chilling effect. I'm not avoiding the chilling effect. I'm going right to it right now.
Okay.
When you were talking about a chilling effect, you were talking about a psychological effect that occurs, right, where individuals feel the need to self-censor in fear of repercussion.
Yes.
Okay, and so the violent aspect or the takeover of public property, right, is a degree of separation from what you would consider to be lawful protest, right?
Under the First Amendment, you have the right I don't know why you're bringing this up.
It absolutely is, because if you're talking about
you won't get deported if you do it for BLM. If an LPR were to do this in support of BLM, they wouldn't get deported. So I don't know why you're bringing this up.
That's not the. I'm explaining it to you. The explanation here is when you're talking about a fucking chilling effect, you are talking about individuals that are engaged in First Amendment free speech protest. Okay, you have the right to peaceable assembly. You don't have the right to take over private property, bar people entry from certain walkways and areas. That is a violate. That is not protected under the First Amendment. Just because that isn't a necessary.
Disagrees with this.
Of the
I don't know why you're
deportation.
Bringing this up. Nobody disagrees with this. Yeah, you don't have a right to obstruct.
Because you critiqued me and explaining the substantive difference between people that are peacefully protesting, not in support of a terrorist organization, but instead in support of liberation of a people and against the state, versus this specific example. And I'm bringing up the fact that it's not peaceable assembly, because that would be a difference in someone peacefully protesting. And the more degrees degrees of separation there are from one case to the individual, the less likely there is to be a chilling effect. If I see somebody that is violent, that is passing out literature for a terrorist organization,
like half of this
that is
answer
saying
was
that
irrelevant.
violence is justified.
This is such a simple thing.
It's not irrelevant. I just explained how it's not irrelevant.
Okay,
that there are degrees of separation that changes the effect of chilling effect.
If you think that you can be deported just for supporting Hamas, okay, without being violent, without engaging in any violence, if you can be deported just for supporting Hamas, do you think that that would create a chilling effect on people who want to protest?
You can't be deported. I don't think you can be deported for that. I think you have to be a representative, which he was.
No, it's literally just for supporting, and it's left in a very vague manner in this law. If you could be deported just for, well, let's assume, okay, if you could be deported just for supporting.
Well, I think to make the connection to terrorist activity, it has to be that way. Like, he has to be either an officer or a representative. He was a representative of QAD, which was engaged in terrorist activity.
He was a representative according, but you don't care about due process, so that doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, you can just, like, due process or not, you can just see, right? He gave speeches at QAD. He claimed that he was there in front of them giving interviews. You had his Columbia University apartheid divestment or divest.
And that's a terrorist organization in the United States?
I didn't say that was a terrorist organization. I said they were engaged in terrorist activity.
What terrorist activity?
When you are taking over, if you are taking over private property, right, for a political goal, then you're engaged in the destruction and seizure of private property for a political goal.
Is that terrorism?
More clear-cut terrorist than that. That's terrorism.
Is that a criminal charge? As defined by who?
Well, I don't know if it's meeting a specific legal doctrine in this.
Well, you just gave me a definition
scholar.
Like it was a legal definition. I don't even know you get charged for terrorism.
Well, no, I'm saying.
Wait. Actually, no, I'll agree with you. I'll agree with you. No, wait. I don't care. It doesn't matter. I'll agree with you. Okay, let's say that I agree with you then. Fine. Mm-hmm. We determined that that's terrorist activity. Do you think that it would cause a chilling effect of you going out and supporting a group like the Palestinians if you could be deported for something like that? Do you think that people would think twice about going out and being a part of a protest if you could get deported if they determined that the protest had become a terrorist protest?
Yeah, I do think that there's like this distinction of like, where they say like if there's a Nazi flag at a protest, then it's a Nazi rally, right? And it's like, was I even there? Did I even see that? Like, I do think that there could be some level of like fear in that, right? Like, there
that's my whole argument. Then what do we disagree on?
For some people.
Yeah, for green card holders.
Well, again, like any action is going to cause some level of chilling effect.
That's fine. That's good. Right? For instance, criminal laws should hopefully create a chilling effect on crime, but we don't want to have a chilling effect on viewpoint, right? On somebody expressing a certain point of view.
But the problem is that you're consistently comparing like a downstream effect, a chilling effect, on things that are disanalogous to the individual in question, right?
No, this isn't about the individual question. It's about the law in question. And it's not just him who's been deported now. There's other people that have been implicated under this. But I'm talking about the law as we're treating it with respect to this individual and then brought into the population. How would this not create a chilling effect if you think you could be deported because you go to a protest supporting the wrong group of people?
Right. If you have that opinion, you probably got that opinion by watching somebody like you that's making that disanalogous connection, but they're not the same thing.
Or you're looking at a guy like this Khalil Mahmoud who's literally being deported without being formally charged with anything, and it's just the word of an organization against his word.
Right. I totally agree that the judge is correct in saying look, there needs to be due process to prove these claims. Right. But what we're saying here, right. And again, what I'm saying is you're saying that there will be a chilling effect if someone is engaged in behavior in one way and then on people that are engaged in similar behavior. Right. So when you say someone shows up to a protest, they're not a representative, right? They're not a representative while the protest is actively engaged in seizing of private property for their political goals. And then, of course, they're not a representative of this organization giving speeches where they're condoning violence as a leader of this group, right? And they're not a representative that is accused. We don't know, that's why I agree with a due process here on whether or not they're passing out literature from Hamas and all that is a wildly different thing than you as a green card holder. Let's say you're from Egypt,
I understand
or
what you're
maybe
saying.
you're a Palestinian refugee, whatever.
You're laying out all these requirements, but nobody is saying that you have to do all of these things to be deported. Nobody's saying you have to engage in every single action that he engaged in to be deported. They're just saying you have to support a terrorist organization. But then why do you keep listing all of these where you're like, well, it's like...
Because you're claiming that there is a chilling effect in regards to this case, or let's say a separate
So you think there is... No, wait, no, Heather. Oh my God, you talk so much. So then let me just hear you say clearly. If he gets deported for this... You're not correcting me. You're just giving the most irrelevant raps or yaps ever. Holy shit. You think that if the government is able to deport this person with no due process whatsoever because of just the claims the government has made about him, you don't think that would create a chilling effect on other nonviolent and innocent protesters who aren't doing any type of terror? You don't think that would create a chilling effect on them at all?
So I'm not like a seer, right? But I do.
You
think,
can't even make a reasonable inference whatsoever. Holy shit. Conservatives always do this game of like, I can't read his mind, I can't tell the future, I can't. Holy fuck. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remain consistent, right?
No, it's
not that crazy.
Okay.
Like, I mean, I get that you don't like my style of talking. I'm not as entertaining as you. I get it, dude. Like, you're super famous because you're better.
No, that's nothing. It's just that
getting to the point, maybe,
yes,
right? Like, maybe I'm too verbose, right?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
right. But I'm
you.
trying to have the actual conversation.
You're not having it. You're having your own. You're fighting shadows right now. I don't know. The conversation is much more simple than you're trying to make it.
Well, I don't think I'm fighting shadows. I think we'll look back and you'll see that there's a lot there. But
I'm sorry, hold on. Just to explain why the whole recent yap was irrelevant, okay? Imagine that did you follow the case of Ahmaud Arbery at all?
I couldn't like I mean like on the news.
Let's assume that what I'm saying is true. Okay, Ahmaud Arbery was jogging. Supposedly, he went into a building that people say was under construction. Some people accused him of robbing from there without good evidence, and then they drove down and they killed him. Okay, and then let's say that the judge looked at it and they said, you know what? I think that vigilantism, when you suspect people of doing a crime, I think that that's actually okay in this circumstance, and you allow those people to walk. And then let's say I come out and I say, well, hold on, don't you think this creates a bad effect in a community where anybody can hunt somebody down and kill them through vigilantism? Don't you think that would be a bad thing for the community? And then you counter, well, if this person was jogging more than a mile away from their house, and if this person was going into a building that was under construction, and if and you start laying out all of the aspects of the Ahmaud Arbery case, I would go, well, hold on. We're not talking about as applied to this very specific case. We're talking about the rule that's now being crafted and that's being cited because they didn't say you had to have all these qualifications to be deported before. These arguments that you're giving about him passing out literature and speaking in front of LUFA or whatever the fuck else, all this shit, the government isn't saying he had to have done all of these things to be deported. They're just saying you have to protest in support of a terrorist organization and that you can be deported. So you don't think that creates a chilling effect on people? I think it's a very obvious answer that, yeah, of course, this will make people incredibly fearful to protest in support of, say, Palestine.
Okay, so again, there's God, man, you have so many layers where you're muddying things, man. You really do.
I'm sorry, explain one thing that I just muddied. Wait, wait. You just said I'm muddying. Explain one thing that I just muddied.
I'm doing it right now. Calm down. So first case, right? Ahmaud Arbery in this situation, and you're utilizing the chilling effect. The examples you're giving are criminal cases.
That's not relevant. That's not relevant that it's criminal. The point is that you don't have to have every single behavior.
You don't have a right. Do you or do you not have a right to green card status under U.S. law?
If you meet the qualifications for it, then yeah, I guess, yeah.
Where are you getting that it is a right? It's a privilege. It's a privilege. Is it not? Do you have a right? Where is the right coming from?
I mean, it's from law. There's statutes that govern how you can apply for green cards, and then you have rights to those green cards once you have them. What do you mean?
I would disagree that there is, maybe someone in chat or someone can find it, where there is a court case that enshrines green card status as a right, as opposed to a privilege, and that you can lose that privilege.
Okay, do you think that owning a firearm in the United States, is that a right or a privilege? Because I would argue that's a right that's enshrined in the Second Amendment, but
by the Constitution, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
But it can be revoked if you're a felon, right? If you're a violent felon, I don't think you can own a firearm, and that's been defended by the Supreme Court. So, is owning firearms just a privilege?
Firearms is complicated because it's like emoluments clause.
Okay, what about voting? Is voting a right? Because you can lose that as well if you're a felon.
Yeah, pursuant to the Constitution, I don't think voting is a right.
Okay, so then there are no rights. So I don't know why you even made that distinction. There are no rights at all. Okay, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm doing an internal critique to showcase that you are, again, muddying the waters because you want me to showcase that, right? Where was it that you were doing it? By comparing U.S. citizens that are accused of a crime and whether or not there is due process for that crime versus whether or not someone that is a green card holder can have that green card status revoked. Would you not agree that there could potentially be legally and that it wouldn't be in any contradiction within U.S. law that there could potentially be different
Yes, but that's not the point of my analogy. We were talking about whether you create a chilling effect and why you don't have to have the underlying, you don't have to match every single element of what another person did to feel like a particular thing could apply to you. It's like saying, give me an example of two things that are sweet, and I say banana and an apple are sweet. And you go, are you really saying a banana and an apple are the same thing? Isn't it possible that these two things be different? Well, of course they're different, but for the purpose of my analogy, that doesn't matter. It's not relevant.
I addressed this already, right? I said that chilling effect is a psychological thing that happens, right?
Yes.
And that anything that the state does, like I could have a chilling effect on all kinds of things,
which is good. We want a chilling effect on some things.
Right. Well, like unreasonable things, right? I could be an unreasonable person and be affected, by some action that is like completely disanalogous.
We're not talking about unreasonable. By definition, we're just talking about reasonable person's fears. So that being
exactly. Well, no, you have to make that distinction so that you can
I don't have to make that distinction because that distinction is already made in law. There's a reasonable person standard that we have in law. You don't say that we make laws for unreasonable people. That's not how it works in the United States, but.
Right, exactly. So we recognize that the chilling effect in under certain situations, like when we talked about gun laws is one that they utilize. I think they had quite a few chilling effect case law in like gun laws, right? Whether or not it was, creating a chilling effect because there was all of these regulations that essentially made it impossible to have a gun there. So people just didn't do it, right? So the reason that I'm showcasing a reasonable versus unreasonable person is that if we recognize that it must be reasonable, you utilizing you're trying to create the new case, right? The new case is what if people are arrested and the only thing they do is protest in support of Hamas. But the original case that we're talking about, why we're talking about the supposed hypocrisy of Asmongold, et cetera, is about Mahmoud Khalil. And so it's absolutely pertinent to showcase all of the ways in which a person that is protesting for Palestine, right, or for Palestinian liberation, that is not a representative, not engaged in property crime.
Sure. Okay. So then here's the question. Yeah, so then let's say that the chilling effect would be unreasonable. So then let's say you're in the United States, okay, and somebody says, "Oh, this guy who's a banker who's Jewish is making way too much money. We're going to go and kill that dude, okay? Because we think it's insane how much money this Jewish banker has made, okay?" Would a Jew in the United States who is a blacksmith, okay, or some other artisan, or a leather crafter, or whatever you want, an 1800s job they have, would that person be right to be afraid? Or would you go, well, no, that was just a Jewish banker. It wasn't anything about like a Jewish craftsman. That was just a banker.
That's actually a really good analogy, right? I would say that there is a difference, but nevertheless, it is a good analogy to showcase how one factor can be so strong that it can be terrifying, right? Which is
it's not that the factor is so strong. Right. It's that the factor is determinative. That's why I'm saying it. Like these laws have to be viewpoint neutral. So, for instance, if he was engaged in all the same behaviors, instead of taking pamphlets from Dua, Lop, or whatever, Kuda, he was taking pamphlets from the BLM organizers. And if instead of going into a building to protest for Palestinians, it was for BLM activism or whatever, like he might even get charged with misdemeanor crimes or whatever, but he's not going to be deported. But because it's Palestinians, which is a viewpoint, whether you support or oppose Palestine.
I feel like Trump probably hates BLM as much as Palestinians, so who knows, right? He is a bit wild, but I don't know that BLM would be classified as a terrorist organization.
Sure. So I'm saying that
he wouldn't have the same authority.
You might have a second thought about supporting and protest of an organization that the president has declared a terrorist organization. Or even let's say he were to declare BLM a terrorist organization. Do you think that would significantly curb the amount of green card holders that protest in favor of BLM?
Okay, so if he were to make BLM a terrorist organization, right, and he were to engage in deporting someone simply for supporting a terrorist organization, right? So these two things would need to be true.
So if he just right now, if he declared BLM a terrorist organization right now, if you were a green card holder, you think you'd be like, no, I'm probably safe to protest until he actually arrests a BLM person. You're willing to be the first case of that?
Well, again, he would like you would these are two separations, right? One is that BLM isn't a terrorist organization, and in the example he declared it as such. And the second is that there have been previous deportations for people simply for protesting in support of a terrorist organization. As so far, I don't have that. Do you have that has occurred, that someone has been deported? I don't think anybody has been deported.
Well, so
in
far,
this case, as of yet,
the
we're waiting
Khalil
trial
Mahmoud guy hasn't been.
injunctions.
Yeah, but it seems like he got
the
picked.
accusations are far more than that, correct?
Yeah, but accusations by who? Has he even been charged with a crime, or what is the process?
The Department of Justice went to Pam Bondi when she gave her statement to the press corps that the reason that this person had popped up on their radar was because he was passing out Hamas literature, right?
Which is fine. In the United States, you can do this, right?
Yes, in the United States, you can do this if you're a citizen, but this is potentially disqualifying as a green card holder alone. But there are several elements,
sure,
right?
But wait. So let's just on that one thing. On that one
right?
thing, are you okay with that? On that one factor, that a U.S. citizen could pass out?
I already told you that I would need proof of property damage or a violation of the non-aggression principle, and that includes illegal aliens too. I don't care if you're an illegal alien. I wouldn't deport anybody unless they had done some form of property crime. So you're asking my position. That's my position.
So then if we had a state that deported people for simply doing a thing that a citizen could do, no problem, right? Because I could go hand out Hamas literature all day and it'd be no problem. But if you were a green card holder, you could have your green card revoked and you could be deported for that. Is this not a problematic environment if we're free speech warriors?
Well, free speech isn't the thing that I would connect to these two things, right? Like
why? Again, it's literally speech.
That's not my
passing out a pamphlet. What could be speech more than that?
Well, again, like my issue with a deportation wouldn't be on speech grounds. It would be on the fact that whether or not they committed property damage. Right?
Well, sure, but I'm saying that if we are going to deport people for a thing that a citizen could do willy-nilly without even being charged with a crime, isn't that kind of problematic if it's not a viewpoint neutral thing? It's not
for sure. Like I agree that it's problematic to do any of this without a trial, number one. And there are substantive reasons that if all of these instances were proven correct, would support the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil. And specifically for me, the key factor is that he engaged in property crime and that property crime was egregious because it was in support of terrorist organizations, et cetera. Now, we can have issues with how Trump or the Trump administration classifies terrorist organizations, right? I mean, you kind of admitted, right? Like in this context, they're not a terrorist organization, but you've called them a terrorist organization plenty of times before.
That's
right?
But that's way different when we're talking about for purposes of like legal distinction. And I have had this conversation on my stream a million times. I've argued with Pisco over it, that terrorism and terrorists are things that we say. We're not really making a huge distinction in terms of what terrorist is. And you're not going to find any way to actually designate or create like a definition of terrorism that we can broadly apply to everything. Like it's a loosey-goosey category of things.
But
these
Hamas
are people that we
is
don't
a terrorist organization from like previously. Like Trump didn't make Hamas a terrorist organization. Like they are a terrorist organization, correct?
Yes.
Like legally speaking.
But the definition for a terrorist organization in the United States is the president says so, which I think is also a problem.
I have no critique of saying that, whether or not they, designate a group of terrorist organizations is problematic. I'm a libertarian and, I've seen plenty of literature that talks about sovereign citizens, ANCAPs, and libertarians are like potential domestic terrorists. And it's like, the fuck are you getting that from? Like we're against the non-aggression principle. Like you couldn't get more peaceful than us other than pacifists, right? Because like that's a silly distinction, right? But again, when we're talking about is somebody like Asmongold or a right-wing pundit or someone talking in politics a hypocrite on the grounds of free speech when they are looking at, European governments that are, going into people's homes, going on raids in Germany because their tweets offended people or because they were praying near abortion clinics versus are they for the deportation of someone whose green card status gets revoked?
Due to their viewpoint. Due to their viewpoint.
Well, you're making the accusation that it's due to the Viewpoint. Like the Trump administration isn't making that accusation. The Trump administration is saying,
well, of course they're not going to, because if they say that, then it's going to be a violation of the First Amendment. Of course they can't admit it's due to Viewpoint. You can't have Viewpoint.
Right, for sure. But like, where's your evidence that it's Viewpoint and then it's not, that it's this person is severely problematic?
Well, I can't ever win that because the president is allowed to declare a group of people. Yeah. Well, they're allowed to declare a group of people a terrorist organization without any process. I think the president could just say these are terrorists. But for whatever thing that you think of, not to be edgy, I can do, sure, I guess. But I mean, like, you're a libertarian, and I'm sure that you've made arguments in the past. I'm sure if I go through your Twitter that anything that you claim Hamas has done would easily fit the U.S. government. I'm sure it would fit the IDF for sure. I probably know every example for where this could apply to the IDF. So if you're going to say that you're supporting terrorism by supporting Hamas, I know that if a president were to come in again next cycle and say, hey, actually, I'm going to declare the IDF a terrorist organization, I'm sure a lot of people in the U.S. would have an issue with that Jews are being deported back to Israel for supporting the IDF.
Well, yeah, for sure. But
I would say that's hypocritical, right? Would that be hypocritical?
Well, no. Well, no, it wouldn't be hypocritical. And the reason it wouldn't be hypocritical is because, and this is like, we both agree that Hamas is engaged in terrorist activity constantly, that they're a terrorist organization. And like, you've done tons of debates.
I don't know if I would agree. I don't know if I would agree with that
Palestinian people that like,
I wouldn't agree with that for legal purposes.
Heavy propaganda.
I wouldn't agree that. I do agree with that. I wouldn't agree with this for legal purposes, though. If we're talking about deporting people, I would only define, if I were to have any definition of terrorism, they would have to be non-state actors at the least, because having a group of people who are represented only by a terrorist organization and then banning protests in favor of that organization, I think is highly problematic. People should be able to protest in favor of the Palestinians in Gaza if they want, and their government, which is Hamas, if they choose to do so.
Okay, but like, so what happens if you have a failed state, right? And then a terrorist organization takes over the failed state. So like, would you say that the Taliban, like, you can't, like if the Taliban are currently fighting in Iraq and Iraq has, a bastion of defense of like, a UN recognized nation state, they're a terrorist organization, that's fine. But the moment that the Taliban take over Iraq, it changes in some capacity because the Taliban are those in charge of Iraq.
I think because they're now the representative body of those people. It becomes incredibly hard to distinguish the two, especially if I'm going to start getting deported for it. Right? It's probably hard to support. Like, I'm sure there are people that support Israel that maybe don't support the actions of the IDF, but would you feel confident as a green card holder that the government is going to be able to make that distinction in your protests if they're going to determine whether or not to deport you? Because I'm sure if you're protesting alongside other people, they probably do support the IDF. And if you're at I support Israel but not the IDF protest, and somebody comes up with a sign saying like the IDF are God's soldiers, are you leaving that protest, or are you going to try to bully them out of it? Like it's just a huge burden that I think is highly problematic and creates a chilling effect on speech.
I do think that, like, I think your examples are unreasonable. That's my issue, right? Like, I think that you were saying, like, when we look at this case has a lot of elements of an outlier, right?
Well, but nobody's ever been deported for when was the last time somebody got deported for something like this? I feel like the last big case I remember had to do with like it was a big sting operation for people in the United States in around like the Miami shooting, I think, but they were providing like support for, I think it was Al Qaeda, but they were trying to like buy weapons and shit for them. I think that's totally fair. So even when it comes to governments, if you're like trying to procure weapons for Hamas or whatever, then I think at that point, even if you're an LPR, fine, we can talk about deportation then. But just for protesting in support of them, even in supporting their actions and saying October 7th was base, fuck Israel, I support the Palestinians and Hamas represents them. I mean, I think that to be viewpoint neutral, we kind of have to allow it. If you support the IDF operations in Gaza, how could you not have another person who's allowed to support Hamas's operations in Israel?
Right. So, I mean, like, you're saying I believe these things. I'm assuming.
Well, I don't know. No, I know that you don't believe them.
You don't believe those, right? No. When I say I mean I quoting you. You don't believe these things, right? You're doing the internal critique of the right wing. Correct?
No, I do believe those things. You should be able to support both for sure. But I would be okay with deporting people providing material support.
But you're in favor of like some level of hate speech laws, right?
Fuck no. What? I think hate speech. I think hate laws are okay as like aggravating charges. So like if you kill somebody and you do it because they're black, then maybe the hate speech like amplifies the charge. But hate speech laws in the United States, in the U.S., no.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm trying to like hammer out your position here. I apologize. I'm not like watching you all the time, right? So are you in favor of laws that are like some like indirect justifications for violence at protests? That's fine, right?
I mean, I think the Brandenburg test works. Like, if it's not a direct incitement, if you don't knowingly,
right.
Yeah, then I think it's.
So you're not saying like, hey, attack that Jew. You're just saying like Jews are evil and attacking them is justified.
Sure, and even maybe like I think death to all Jews or something that might be defensible speech in the United States. Sure.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm just trying to understand your position. I'm not trying to like get you on a gotcha. I'm just not trying to be like. Anyways, so. In this regard, the hypocrisy that we're isolating here is that the chilling effect from not Mahmoud Khalil, right? But the justification for Mahmoud Khalil specifically being a lack of due process and the idea that the only thing that you need to do to lose your green card status is be at a protest that is supporting a arbitrarily designated terrorist group is antithetical to conservatives' other positions and broad interpretations of free speech. That's the argument?
Yes. Just as a real quick thing, when I say viewpoint neutral, I'm not trying to whatever. Do you understand what I mean when I say viewpoint neutral?
Well, I mean, like, sure.
Just as a quick thing, when I say,
like, let me get what you're saying.
Yeah, wait, real quick.
Right?
Yeah,
like,
when I say viewpoint neutral,
another party or something.
When I say viewpoint neutral, I mean that the law or whatever that is prohibiting some behavior isn't reliant upon the viewpoint of the speaker. So, if, for instance, if I say you're not allowed to firebomb buildings, that's a viewpoint neutral law. If I say you're not allowed to firebomb buildings when you're supporting BLM, that's not a viewpoint neutral. Or you're not allowed to bully people in restaurants if you're a conservative, that wouldn't be viewpoint neutral. It's considering the viewpoint of the author in determining whether or not the behavior is legal or illegal. Generally, all laws in the United States have to be viewpoint neutral. There's a really good reason for that. So my charge is that because my charge is that the only reason why Hamas is designated even as a terrorist organization and why this law is being enforced so harshly on this particular person is because of the lack of viewpoint neutrality. It's because they support a group that Trump disagrees with politically.
Wait, hold on. So, I mean, who originally designated Hamas a terrorist organization?
I don't know. They've probably been designated for a long time. But this is the first time I've heard of somebody being deported for protesting in support of them. Keep in mind that these protests happened originally under Biden, right? And I don't remember anybody being deported or talking about deportations there under him.
Say that happened in 1997. So would that be Bill Clinton administration, right?
Sure.
It's Clinton administration.
Sure.
October 97. Yeah. All right. So Hamas has been a terrorist organization since 97. Why is it lacking viewpoint neutrality? Like from your perspective, if the law is that you lose your green card status and it can be revoked if you are engaging in all of these things, and it's not Hamas, but it's terrorist activity. Like,
because the only time I've ever seen this be enforced is right now under the Trump administration against the left.
Okay, but that's not an argument against that, right? Like why is it lacking viewpoint neutrality if it is a terrorist organization, not like Trump arbitrarily made something a terrorist organization?
It's the enforcement. It's the arbitrary enforcement of it.
Okay, so it's not the viewpoint neutrality of the law itself, but the fact that Trump decided to go after
as hard as possible.
The specific person.
Yeah.
Okay. So
the law itself, I don't think it has a problem with viewpoint neutrality. I don't believe it, or it definitely doesn't, because you could designate anybody a terrorist group.
Right. I mean, so is it because the hypocrisy on free speech here then becomes down to Trump's enforcement of the law. He chooses to enforce a law that wasn't commonly enforced to get rid of people. And your claim is that he's doing it because they disagree with me?
Yes, and I think there's other evidence that I would use to support his enforcement of laws that way. Yes, and that seems to be a consistent thing that he does. So the two examples I would say is like pardoning J6ers was utilizing the pardon power in a highly politically charged way. I would say that the 7-country ban was done in a way against. He wanted originally to do all Muslims, then eventually did 7 Muslim majority states or whatever. That like he shows a political bend to the people that he targets, and it seems like this particular thing with the enforcement of the deportation here seems to be not an outlier, but consistent with his prior behavior.
Yeah, so with the January 6th situation, right, there have been political pardons before. I mean, his argument would obviously be that these were politically targeted individuals, right? Obviously, you feel very differently about that, but I don't know, like, I don't think we're going to just agree that, right? I think you have a strong opinion about J6ers that most conservatives don't, in terms of like whether or not they're political prisoners, right? Whether or not they were held in solitary confinement for too long.
Sure,
but
we can't.
Was too harsh.
Yeah, I don't think we can have reasonable minds can't disagree here, though. If you disagree on this point, you've lost the plot, and there's no communicating at that point. I think because these are people that were charged by the federal government. They were convicted of crimes in front of juries. Like, if you think these are political prisoners at this point, then you can define anything as anything if you want.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that the opinion of Mini MAGA would be, you know, whatever, like you said, lost the plot. Like, oh, these people are all innocent. These were nothing but grandmas that went through, when some of them obviously engaged in violence. But you could very easily say that they have already served their time, and that they felt that it was a level of cruel and unusual punishment, and that the pardons were, Yeah,
but there's a process to challenge that, right? That's what the appeals courts and everything are for.
Well, I mean, pardoning is a process as well. Like, you could make the same claim about like Biden, right? And be like, hey, there's a process, you know, but he doesn't trust the Trump administration to utilize that process effectively against his family and friends. So he pardons them. Or maybe he didn't auto pin, whatever. I don't care. Right. Like, it's a silly thing. But so that's one example, right? Which is about their viewpoints. I don't know that you're. I think
to be clear, hold on, so I can understand. You think that Donald Trump, you think I'm making a leap of logic. You think Donald Trump doesn't exercise viewpoint-dependent authority, that he's just exercising the law blind to the political views of people, and he's just exercising what he thinks, he's carrying out what justice is. It just so happens that it's always against the left and never against the right?
Well, I would say that any president that isn't like an artificial intelligence, right?
Okay, well then let's compare.
Bias,
sure, then let's
right?
compare. Wait. So that's a factual argument. So then let's compare. When Biden came into office, he allowed the special prosecutor to remain that was investigating Hunter Biden, and he allowed Durham to continue his special investigation into Biden over the secret documents, right? When Trump was president, he fired Comey from the FBI, and he did everything he could to shut down the Mueller investigation. And now that he's president again, all the Jack Smith stuff has been dismissed, is gone. So these don't seem to be the same. There's a substantive difference between how the two treat being investigated and how they treat the legal system. Being investigated and them engaging in different. I'm trying to connect this. Like, your argument is what exactly? Like, I understand. My argument is that Donald Trump weaponizes
factual arguments, presumably. Right?
Sure, Donald Trump has weaponized the legal system to prosecute political enemies, and the Republicans in general have done this, and the Democrats, for the most part, seem to be following established process and procedure, and even give room to their adversaries for their investigations. Where we got all the Hunter Biden shit from. Biden, if he was like Trump, could have easily come in and shut all that down, but he didn't. He allowed all that to continue. Donald Trump would never allow his child to be charged with a crime.
I mean, like, we could get into that, but I feel like that is like a whole nother rabbit hole of a conversation about whether or not we think Democrats in general, or the Biden administration versus the Trump administration, like what is and isn't, political witch hunts against one person versus what isn't. You know what I mean? I feel like that would. I feel like we're getting to a place anyways where we're likely wrapping up our arguments on this. And if you want to, I mean, I guess we can get into that, but I don't know that it's necessarily helpful to this conversation to engage with the claim that Democrats are largely utilizing the legal process appropriately, and that Republicans, or at least Trump, is largely weaponizing it against his enemies. I think you would find massive disagreement on that.
Well, but only with people who aren't familiar with
plenty of debates.
Yeah, but only with people who aren't familiar with the facts. And this has been consistent with every single conversation I've had on this. Like, if I were to ask, for instance, what's the similarity to the pardoning of Eric Adams? What's one similar thing a Democrat has done in the past 25 years?
Dude, I'm not prepared to have a conversation, like researched well enough to bring back and recollect with my notes on these specific details versus the other. I'm perfectly fine with saying that I have other domains that I'm usually practice in, which is philosophy, as opposed to those things. I don't.
Okay, but I'm just curious when you think, because you've got a feeling in your mind of the Democrats are just as bad as the Republicans on this. What is in your mind? What's the most egregious abuse of weaponization of the legal system that the Democrats have engaged in, for you to have that feeling?
Yeah, I think. Are we specifically talking about Republicans in general, or
Republicans versus Democrats? What's a way that Democrat anyway, the ways that you feel like Democrats have weaponized the justice system in a way that is similar?
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, so I would say that probably the Jean Carroll case was one, but of course that's just a judge. That's not the Democrats in at all. New York and their the whole 34 felonies situation, I think was rather egregious as a case.
Why was it egregious? Or why do you feel like it was egregious? Assuming the facts of the case are true, that Donald Trump was using campaign funds secretly and then lying about them to give them to a guy to pay off somebody to hide a story.
Yeah, so I mean, again, like I said, this isn't the conversation that I came prepared for, but off the top of my head, right? The initial crime that he's suspected of would no longer fall in the statute of limitations unless connected to another crime. Mm-hmm. They were given, multiple choices on what they could attempt to connect him with, which kind of leads to a contradiction in guessing what the motivations were as a means of going after him, as opposed to just charging him with a specific connection.
Well, wait,
they couldn't make any one specific connection.
Well, I mean, they did make that connection. That's what happened. They did make that connection, and that connection was real. Well, I remember he was convicted in front of him.
There was 3 connections that they had a choice to pick from, right?
Sure.
That were connected to the money laundering. Again, I'd have to go through.
Yeah, but it's up to them to pick the strongest case. Okay, sure. But I just I came prepared to debate the concept of free speech, the Asmongold critique, why you believe that there was hypocrisy in that regard, and the case as so far as it applies to Mahmoud Khalil and situations in Europe, not necessarily court cases of Donald Trump or the Democratic administration in terms of how they use the Justice Department. Yeah, I'm aware of that. Yeah,
years.
But you had an impression. I was curious what the impression was based on, but because every single person I've debated on this or argued with this always has a strong impression, and when I ask them for anything, they don't ever have an example. So I'm just curious where the impression comes from.
Well, I would say primarily my impression comes just from I don't want to be a broken record, but as an anarchist, right? I just don't trust any of these fucking people or any of these institutions. And you know what I mean? So I immediately assume most politicians and people that are career politicians are I start with the default assumption that they're dirty, that they're corrupt, that they take money from different places, that they abuse their power when they have the means of abusing their power.
But even as a libertarian or ANCAP, not all bad is the same bad, right? I'm sure that you would admit that maybe in a democracy, a politician might be corrupt, but that's going to be probably a different level of corruption than an oligarchy or dictatorship or monarch, right? That there's levels to it, right? Or certain politicians can be more corrupt than others in the United States, right?
Yeah. Or they're corrupt in different ways, right?
Sure.
Right? You know what I mean? I might agree that a monarchy is better than a democracy, for example. Pardon me. Right, because I think democracy is inherently worse than monarchy systems, but that's a whole nother conversation. So I guess, do you have some closing on this position of why you think there's hypocrisy presented in him, or do you want me to go first and you respond? It doesn't matter, or is there some other thing? I feel because I just don't think I haven't seen the connection still. It just seems like there's so many we're tenuous connections to try and draw this. I don't know. I remain unconvinced. It seems like a bullshit critique.
I'm never convincing you. I understand that. What was the most tenuous of connections, just to be clear, in my argument? What do you think was the one that was the weakest connection?
So the weakest connection, I Actually, I'll go with the last poor connection, right? Which is that the chilling effect would occur, and that this would be anti-free speech because there's a chilling effect specifically on green card holders who would go to peacefully protest at an event where there was some other group that might support Hamas, and that is connected to this case in, Mahmoud Khalil, when there are all of these other elements. And I think that that's an unreasonable connection. But that's like the most recent one, right?
Okay. I feel like I made my argument. You can have your final say or whatever.
Yeah, I'm Fabian Liberty. You can find me Fabian Liberty. Just Google it. I remain unconvinced that there is this clear hypocrisy. I think it's just being spicy on Twitter to try and get engagement. And I think you prove that on Twitter when you were like, here's my real argument. And you backpedaled in that degree. And yeah, I wish someone with as much clout as you, as much attention as you would care more about the principles as opposed to just whatever wavering thing gets you the attention or gets you the dub in the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that conversation.
A good one.
Never again, okay? Holy fucking AIDS Christ. I knew this conversation would go this way because every time we talk about it, it's the same type of conversation. Don't ever let me do this again. Don't let me do it. Not with Fabian, okay? We know this. I know this, okay? We're smarter than this. Don't let us do this. Holy shit. Holy Can you summarize both of your positions? Yeah, I think I typed it in chat before the debate happened. Basically, his position is he wanted to take a basic logical analysis of the two statements that we'd made to try to spot a logical contradiction. So in one statement, somebody says A is greater than B, and then in another statement, a person says B is less than A or something, or A is less than B, sorry. And he's trying to find a contradiction, like a logical contradiction like that. And if the contradiction can't be found between both statements, then he would say that logically speaking, you haven't proven hypocrisy because you don't have that contradiction. My argument is obviously not heavy like philosophy, prop logic based. It's more of these are the general positions of conservatives as not embellished, emblemized by Asmongold. I think that they have a very broad reading of the First Amendment when it comes to viewpoints that they support. So, for instance, going to Europe and bullying them about freedom of speech, and they have a very narrow reading of freedom of speech when it comes to people that they want to get rid of. So they weaponize the concept. And then here's the examples. But since Asmongold hadn't said each of those individual statements, I guess, in the right way in those arguments, that somehow that wasn't sufficient to demonstrate a hypocrisy that would satisfy somebody doing a textual analysis of both statements, which is not. But I think I'm pretty sure I typed it in chat. This is how this conversation was going to go. So Fabian is a big ANCAP libertarian philosophy memer who it's just his style of conversation. You could counter by saying logically that freedom of speech requires due process. Yeah, but then his response was, it's not fair to assume that Asmongold believes in due process or whatever because he didn't have it in the statement. It was just dumb. What is your position on chilling effect and hypocrisy? I think that if the government is allowed to deport you for protesting in support of a certain people, that people are just going to be less likely to protest in support of those people. That if somebody were to go out now and protest for Palestine or whatever, if you were a green card holder, you might be a bit discouraged or heavily discouraged from engaging that protest because now you don't know if you might get deported or lose your green card that due to what you're protesting. And I think that's a pretty easy, obvious jump, but